Welcome to 18th Century Cooking. I'm your host, John Townsend, and today we're doing the quintessential Christmas dessert of the 18th century. Yeah, plum pudding. You've heard of it, and it's going to be great. Thanks for joining us today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. So we don't think too much about plum pudding today, except in these strange literary references. But in the 18th century, it was referenced hundreds and hundreds of times. It's a very, very popular dessert in England and in North America in our time frame. One of the most common references that we are used to is in Dickens's A Christmas Carol. And here's a section. This is Mrs. Cratchit. In a half a minute, Mrs. Cratchit entered, flushed, but smiling proudly with the pudding, like a speckled cannonball, so hard and firm, blazing in a half a quartern of ignited brandy, and bedight with Christmas holly stuck in the top. Yes, plum pudding was a Christmas dessert, as well as just a standard dessert that was common, but very, very particularly for Christmas. Now, what does it mean by a plum pudding? What are the plums in a plum pudding? Well, plums aren't the plum from a plum tree, but they are raisins. Here's Johnson's dictionary from 1809. He says, a plum, it's either a fruit or dried grapes or 100,000 pounds. Well, dried grapes are what they mean by plums in a plum pudding. A plum can really just mean sort of anything sweet, and raisins were used as a sweet in the 18th century. So that's the plum in our plum pudding. So I dug through all the cookbooks, and there were many, many recipes. I picked out the one from the London Art of Cookery by Farley because it's the simplest and it's got some good instructions here. A plum pudding boiled. Cut a pound of suet into little pieces, but not too fine. A pound of currants washed clean. A pound of raisins stoned. 8 yolks of eggs and 4 whites. Half of a nutmeg grated. A teaspoonful of beaten ginger. A pound of flour. And a pint of milk. Beat the eggs first, then put them in half the milk and beat them together, and by degrees stir in the flour. Then the suet, the spice, the fruit, and as much milk as will mix it well together, very thick. It will take 5 hours boiling. We're going to take a page out of a couple of other recipes to make this one a bit more festive with a few extra ingredients. We don't want to boil our pudding for 5 hours, so we're going to make a smaller version. We're going to go with a 1/3 size. So basically 6 ounces of all the main ingredients, and then we add in the spices and whatnot. So let's start off just like the recipe did. I'm not going to do the special thing with the eggs because we only have 3 eggs in this. So rather than do something like 2 whole eggs and 1 yolk, we're just going to put 3 eggs in there. Let's not complicate it. On a recipe like this, it's not going to make that much difference. So 3 whole eggs. Our eggs are whisked up. I'm going to add, it says add in half the milk. So we don't want to go crazy with our milk. We will use that milk, this extra milk later on, to bring our consistency up. If it's too thick, we can add some of that extra milk and get where we need to go. One of our additional ingredients, which you do not have to include. Again, this is very, very additional. As a Christmas pudding, many of the recipes have a little bit of brandy put in. So I'm going to go ahead and put in a touch of brandy. So let's start adding some of these ingredients to it. I'm going to start off with our flour. Again, I'm not going to add it all at once because I don't want it to get all lumpy. Starting to really thicken up. Let's put our sweetmeats in. And you heard raisins and currants. And the currants in here, there are 2 kinds of currants. The currants come off of a currant bush, or again, currants are just little tiny raisins. And we're going to be using those type. That's what's typically meant in these recipes. And I've got, this seems like a lot, doesn't it? Yep, we're going to put them all in there. Boop. All those currants in there. Now, the raisins. And again, we've got 6 ounces of raisins along with 6 ounces of currants. That's a lot of raisins. There we go. I'm gonna go ahead and add our spices in now. Again, before it gets too thick, to mix it well. Half a teaspoon of ginger, powdered ginger. And it called for, in that recipe, a whole half of a nutmeg. Of course, this is a 1/3 recipe, so we don't need a whole half of a nutmeg in this. But I mean, could you go wrong? Let's start to fold in our suet. Suet is one of those special things. To make a proper boiled pudding like this, you've got to have suet. And it's not something that we typically have in our supermarkets here in North America. This is not just regular muscle fat, but it's kidney fat. It's this very, very waxy fat. And it has a very high melting temperature. So what happens here is we put it in and it is mixed all throughout this mixture. And as it boils, it liquefies and creates little holes. It gives it a sort of a fluffy quality, if you can call it that. So in it goes. And it needs to be kind of in little bits. It can't be in these great big blobs. I kind of cut it so that it's very frayable and can break up into our pudding into little pieces all over. Okay, our consistency is still looking really good. It's, now this is a Christmas one, and we can add some extra colorful sweetmeats to it. So I've got some candied orange peel. I'm not gonna have to put a bunch of that in there. We've got plenty of sweets in here already. There's some candied lemon peel. And if you want something very, very colorful in there, something like candied cherries. Again, they had all these sort of sweetmeats in the time period, and it would be something that went into a fancy pudding. So we've got a nice homogeneous mix here. And the consistency is pretty thick, but I'm gonna continue to add just a little bit of flour until it gets a bit more thick. And really the issue has to do with, as that boils, you don't want the individual components, especially the raisins, to all sink down to the bottom, and then it won't look right. It needs to be, the consistency needs to be over the whole piece, so we need it to be, that's why they call for a stiff mixture when it's done. This mix is perfect right now. It's very colorful and it smells great. It's gonna go in, and I can't wait to see how it's gonna look when it comes out. Now it's time to get it ready to go into the pudding cloth. So our pudding cloth is an essential piece of equipment in making this particular dish, and we have to prepare it. We have to get it ready. And so what we're going to do is take our pudding cloth. Now, when I say a pudding cloth, I mean a finely woven, fairly thin piece of cloth like muslin, not cheesecloth. That will not work. Don't use cheesecloth. We're going to take a nice piece here. This is 18 inches square. I'm gonna dunk it in my boiling water just for a second and then take it out. And now we're gonna set it out in this fairly large bowl and flour that. So we're gonna spread flour all over the interior of that. That'll help the pudding stay together and not seep through the pores of the cloth. That's why we don't wanna use cheesecloth, because the pudding will just basically dissolve right through the cheesecloth, so don't use that. And then we bring this up semi-tight and tie it off with a string. We want it to be a fairly strong string. We don't want that to break. Now this will probably grow a little bit as it boils. It'll get tight, but that will make a nice round shape, and that's what we're looking for. We don't want it so tight though that it bursts its cloth. There are people talking about that in the 18th century. Oh no, my pudding cloth burst and it ruined my pudding. We don't want that. And once that's all tied up, it's ready to go into our boiling water. Now this one won't have to take 5 hours. This one, this third size, about 2.5 hours. So it's boiling away. You want to make sure the water's boiling the whole time. Now I did a bunch of research on this particular dish because it's just so important. And I found it very, very interesting that it shows up over the entire social spectrum. This is a description from about a poorhouse in 1724 in England. It goes through the house and the people that are in it and the work that they have to do, and also their entire diet. It has the whole menu here. But at the end of this menu, it says, bread and beer were allowed to all without limitation. They have roast beef at the 3 great festivals and plum pudding at Christmas. So even in the poorhouse, the poorest of the poor here are being fed plum pudding at Christmas. So here it is on the poorest table possible, and yet in 1711 we have William Byrd III's diary, and he's in Virginia, and he writes about having plum pudding for dessert. He has puddings all the time, and this is a very, very well-to-do man, and he's having puddings. Is very, very common dish, even in Virginia in the early 18th century. Now, what about other situations? Say Revolutionary War America. There's a great reading from Thomas Anbury's journal, and he talks about traveling as a prisoner of war officer in 1778, and he's staying in different kind of houses as they travel from one spot to another. And here he's talking about his host. He says, he has engaged for some time past among his friends and relations. He would stay at home and entertain us an excellent Christmas dinner, not even forgetting the plum pudding. So here is Revolutionary War America, and there's somebody having a Christmas dinner, and there it is, plum pudding all over again. It's showing up all over these amazing places, and not just in the 18th century, but in the 19th century, like the Christmas Carol, or even before that. A Voyage to Virginia, 1649. The feast of Christmas came upon us, which we began with a very melancholy solemnity. And yet, to make some distinction of the times, the scrapings of the meal tubs were all massed together to compose a pudding, Malaga sack, sea water, with fruit and spice, all well fried in oil, were the ingredients of this regale, which raised some envy in the spectators, but allowing some privilege to the captain's mess. We met no obstruction, but did peaceably enjoy our Christmas pudding. 1649. Even aboard ship, when they had no rations left, on Christmas, they tried to put together a Christmas pudding. That's how important this particular dish is to this time of year. This one's ready to eat. Let's just see how it turned out. Now, I put a pudding sauce on top of this. Many of the recipes call for a simple pudding sauce: butter, sugar, wine, or something like this, butter, sugar, and brandy. The wine turns out great, or just plain butter and sugar. It's got so many different interesting flavors going on in this. You know, the raisins for their sweetness. But raisins bring in a lot more flavor than just sugar, which we might, use today. It's got a lot of savoriness to it also. All that suet, while you might think, yuck, that's got this weird, fat flavor to it. It doesn't. It brings in this wonderful savoriness to this, along with the sweetness. So it's a real complex kind of dessert compared to what kind of we're used to today. Just, sugar on top and nothing else. So there's a whole bunch to this, and we get to choose also as we make our pudding sauce as to just how sweet this gets. We can make it a real sugary sauce, and we can use a lot of it, or we can make it a very buttery sauce with just a little bit of sugar, and wow, it really brings out all these flavors, and we get all this sweetness, and it's very moist, very, very moist. It's really something that should come back into popularity because it is just so good and so Christmas. If you have never had a boiled pudding before, and this is not the easiest technique in the world, But it really is something you need to try out. And this is the perfect time of year for it. When we need to take a little extra time for the holidays. We need to take extra time cooking a special dish. This is one of those things. It is so quintessentially Christmas, and it is the perfect thing for you to try out this time of year. I hope you have a very Merry Christmas, and thanks for watching. We've all heard the saying, American is apple pie. The question is, what are the real origins of apple pie? That's what we're going to be looking at today. Thanks for joining us. So where does American apple pie come from? Well, if we look back in the cookbooks and we dig back to, say, the early 19th century or, say, 1850, that's when American cookbooks really start to, you get a lot of them. 1824, Virginia housewife, you'll find an apple pie recipe that you're probably used to. If we dig back a little bit further, we get back to the first American cookbook, Amelia Simmons's American Cookery. She's got an apple tart that's we might still call an apple pie, but the origins have to come a little bit deeper than that. If we dig back a little bit deeper, another 20 or 30 years, we find some English cookery cookbooks which have apple pies, kinds that maybe we are a little bit more used to. Today we'll be looking at a particular apple pie recipe, very similar to others, out of the Universal Cookbook. This one's done by John Townsend in 1773. Let's get started. You're looking for pie apples to start off with. We've got some Golden Delicious here. That's going to work. The Jonathan apples make a nice pie apple. In the time period, you'll see a lot of references to codling apples. Again, those are a cooking apple or a baking apple. That's what we want for our apple pie, and that's what the recipe calls for. We need to pare our apples, so we would need to take the peels off with these. And we're going to save these peels. We're going to use them in just a little bit. Once we've got our apples peeled, we can quarter them and cut the cores out and then set our apples aside. And now with the peels, we want to take a little saucepan, and you can take all your peels, maybe even some of your cores, but I wouldn't do that. But take these peels a little bit with a little bit of water, and what we want to do is set this over the fire and kind of boil this down. You could even use apple cider as instead of the water. What we're doing is making a concentrated apple saucy flavor that we're going to add to the pie in a little bit. So let's just put this on a low simmer while we work on the rest of this. Now that our apples are pared and cut up, let's work on our pie plate so we can start to assemble this pie. Now this recipe is not like a standard apple pie that we would do. We would put a crust in this entire pie plate. But like so many of these English pie recipes, this one calls for puff paste, and the puff paste just goes around the lip or the outside edge of this. So obviously we're not going to have a slice of pie like we expect today. That's not how they would have necessarily served it. So I've got a little bit of puff paste here, and we're just going to put it around the outside of our dish. There's our paste, at least our lower paste. We actually are going to cover this pie up later on. Now we get to put our apple slices in, or at least the first part of our apple slices. So we put in a layer of apples. And obviously, depending on how big your pie plate is, you may only need a single layer. I don't know if I'm going to be able to get a whole lot more than a single layer in this one, but we're going to get a layer of apples in the bottom. After we get our first layer in, we can add a little bit of sugar here. I would put in maybe, it depends on the sweetness of your apples, but, and of course the recipe says sweeten to taste. So I'll go with about 1/4 cup, maybe a little bit less, and then we could put a little bit more apples in here. Actually, before we put in the next layer, let's put in our spice or our added flavor, and they call for lemon zest. And so actually chopped up lemon peel. So I got what we would call lemon zest, the very outer layer of lemon. We're gonna put that in here, a nice goodly amount. And I'm gonna add a little bit of lemon juice while I'm at it. And this will give it a nice tart flavor Before we put in our last layer, we can put in a little bit of spice here. There are not many spices called for in this other than the lemon here, but possibly a little bit of nutmeg, or usually even cinnamon isn't talked about until we get to the 19th century. So we're gonna go with a little bit of nutmeg. Don't need very much in this. The apples are really gonna carry most of that along with the lemon juice. Let's go ahead and put in the last little bit of apple. Some recipes, especially early on, they really turn these apples into more like apple sauce. But we want them to still have some body, like an apple pie that we're used to today. And this recipe does call basically just for quartering them, not even small slices. So we want them to still be apple-like when we take them out. For some extra spice, add a blade of mace to the peels and the cider. So our peels and the cider and a little bit of mace is boiled down. And we're just going to pour a little bit of this over the top. This will give an extra sauce down in the bottom. Now the final part is to add a little bit more sugar up on top. Again, about the same amount as you put in the lower section, maybe a quarter cup. Again, depends on the sweetness of your apples. And this is ready to have the top crust put on. You'll want your crust to seal up, so you might want to add a little bit of water to the very edge. And this is all sealed up and it's ready to go in the oven, in a modern oven in your kitchen. You'll probably want to set it to 375 degrees and it'll probably cook for, let's say 35 to 45 minutes. You'll be able to tell by the top crust. If you want it to get a real nice brown color, you'll probably want to brush a little bit of egg on top to get a nice color to it. Let's get this one going. There's our pie. It looks wonderful. It's cooled off enough that we can handle it. Now, normally we might serve it just like this, but all these recipes sort of agree that we're going to do a little bit more to this pie. The first step is to cut the top of it off. I'm just gonna slice around the top of this, and we want to take the top off. Now we're not gonna discard this top, obviously. There we are. Oh, smells wonderful. Smells very nice. So here's our old pie there. Next up, what we need to do is pour in a special custard. Now, John Townsend's recipe in the Universal Cook, he does not do a very good job of explaining what's going on with this custard. And you know what? We'll do a different episode specifically on this custard, but now we're gonna take this custard and pour it in to the top of our pie. There we are. And you want it to sort of cover up the entire top of it. There's our custard. Now we're going to set this aside for just a second and let's deal with this top that we had. Now it calls for cutting the top up in triangles, little triangles. I don't know how big, it doesn't say, explain that. So we're just going to cut this up in slices and then turn those into triangles. Now we take our little triangles and we put them in here. Now it says there are a couple different directions maybe, but they're all very similar. We can either lay them around the outside edge, and we'll do a couple like that, with I guess it said with the points out, just to make it look festive, because this is sort of a complicated recipe, so it probably is meant for festive occasions. And then we can put some that are vertical if we can get that to work. I guess it all depends on how thick our custard is. So we're ready to serve this up. Now obviously, since we can't slice this out in regular pie pieces, it's just gonna have to get put into a little, into individual servings. Just kind of scoop it out here. And I'll make sure to get one of those triangles of puff paste, because that's gonna be good. And there we are. We'll set this that one aside. Whew. Smells really, really good, and I can see where this custard would come in. You mean we like to eat our apple pie with ice cream? They had ice cream in the time period, but it'd be a lot easier to make a custard like this. So let's find out how it turns out. Wow, whoa. What a wonderful combination. Puff paste, custard, apple pie, all built into one. Really, really tremendously good. I love this, going back just a little bit deeper and finding this English recipe for apple pie right out of the late 18th century. Today's recipe is a Twelfth Night cake.
It comes from Richard Briggs' 1788 cookbook, The English Art of Cookery.
Thanks for joining us today on 18th Century Cooking. So before we get started with this Twelfth Night cake, let's talk just a little bit about the Twelfth Night itself.
Yeah, you know, when I was a kid, we sang the song 12 Days of Christmas.
12 Days of Christmas.
Had no idea what it was about. It was a
Right.
fun song, but it didn't make any sense to me. I wanted 12 Days of Christmas.
Sure, don't we all?
Yeah, but here in America, there's the 25th of December.
Right, and then it's over.
Right. So the 12 Days of Christmas actually refers to a period or a season that they've celebrated for centuries.
Right. And it's still celebrated. I mean, you'll find that in other cultures, even in Great Britain, I think they probably do a little bit more of that than certainly we do. We don't do any of that.
Right. It was the period of time between Christmas and Epiphany when the wise men were supposed to have shown up.
So that's 12th night, but there's some special 12th night sort of happenings that go on, aren't there?
Right.
Or 12th day.
You know, in researching this, I was finding extra culinary references to Twelfth Night.
Right.
A letter from a mother to her son. We've sent you this 12th cake. We assume we don't have to give you directions on how to use it. We see these pictures of these massive cakes in some 18th century illustrations. Right. Yeah, enormous. One picture, 2 guys had to carry it. But interestingly, we don't find recipes that are specifically called 12th cakes or 12th night cakes.
But I don't think that's strange. I mean, we don't have a special, you don't go into our cookbook today and say, this is a wedding cake or here's a birthday cake, this is a birthday cake recipe. No, we just make a cake recipe and we call it a birthday cake.
The first recipe that I have found was in 1807, John Mallard's 3rd edition of his The Art of Cookery, where he actually gives it a title, a name, 12th cake. But that doesn't mean that that was the first time. You know, that was the invention of the 12th cake. It goes way, way, way back. You can see it in the illustrations and read it in the text.
Right. So let's get started. The very first thing we want to work on are is getting the pan ready, or in this case, our cake form.
Right. We're using hoops. You find references to these in the cookbooks. They're called garths. We have a tin hoop. Our coppersmith actually makes these. Peter Goebel. It's reproduction, 18th century reproduction. This, though, our wooden hoop, we've kind of cheated, haven't we?
Right. This hoop actually comes from our sieves, our brand new sieves that we're carrying. You can disassemble this sieve. You may not be able to reassemble it again.
Nope.
But it makes a perfect, it's exactly the same size as our tin one. And they talk about using wood ones instead of tin ones, that they actually might work better. They won't burn the cake.
Right.
Because they don't transmit that heat in quite the same way. They're sort of insulated.
These cakes are very dense and they're very heavy. In fact, the recipe that we're using, we're cutting it into fourths and it's going to produce a 5-pound cake. So just imagine a 20-pound cake. It would take a much larger hoop than this. And the wood actually shields the outside of the cake to keep it from burning. Those larger cakes, they would often put even like a paste or a pastry paste in the bottom and let it absorb the majority of the heat so that the cake itself isn't burned. I've got 2 circles of parchment paper. And you would really want to start off by covering, it's going to be the bottom of your garth or hoop. And you would lay this on top and then just go around and crinkle it down to get it to fit. And once you have it down, kind of formed around it, we need to tie it on.
If you're having trouble getting this string good and tight on there, you can add a little wedge. That'll get it nice and tight without you having to fuss with the knot.
All right, so now that we have the paper on the bottom, we're going to butter this up. It's important that you butter it up. It just the cake won't stick to it, and so I'm going to go on ahead and just slime this all around. Try and fill in, especially that crack along the edge. We need to line the side of this as well. So I've got a long strip here that's cut long enough to go all the way around. And it helps, you know, to butter lay it out flat on the table, butter the paper first and then put it in so that the butter is on the inside, not on the outside. And that kind of helps the paper to stick together there at where it overlaps, and that way it won't keep collapsing.
This is ready to go, and now we can start on the main preparation.
Right, right.
The recipes can be very specific. They actually call for making sure to have all your ingredients ahead of time so that you've got them all set out before you start mixing it.
So this recipe calls for a full pound of butter, as well as about a half pound of sugar. We have 8 eggs, and we've separated the yolks from the whites. After that, we have 3 cups, or about a pound, of flour, along with 3/4 of a teaspoon of ground mace and ground nutmeg.
Then we have a half a cup or a gill of brandy, a 1/4 cup each of candied orange, lemon, and citron rind, 1 cup of slivered almonds, and a pound of Zante currants. But for 12th night, there's one more ingredient, right?
Yeah, we can't forget the coin, or the bean.
If you're going to use a coin, make sure it's not copper. Silver would be best. Let's start off with the very easiest mixing here because it's gonna get much tougher later on. I'm gonna mix the currants, and these are Zante currants. They're basically miniature raisins. We're gonna mix the currants along with all these sweetmeats that we've picked out. Also in goes the slivered almonds, or the sliced almonds here.
Oh, while John's doing that, I got the easier of the 2 jobs. I'm gonna take the flour, 3 cups, and the nutmeg and the mace, and we're gonna mix that up. And when we get both of these mixed up separately, we're gonna set them aside, and then the fun begins. You need to whip the whites and the yolks.
And separately.
30 minutes if you're doing it by hand.
Okay.
I'll catch up with you later. I'm gonna take this pound of butter. Now this butter is semi-soft, all right? But I need to cream it. Now, in a modern kitchen, you would cream butter by sticking it in a mixer, but they didn't have mixers in the 18th century. So you had to do it by hand. And the warmth of your hand will soften the butter. And as you squeeze it and work it, you're gonna start working air into it. Until finally, it's going to look like a yellow whipped cream. When this butter's softened up, we can go on ahead and add our half a pound of sugar, and I'll continue beating this up until this is really nice and smooth and fluffy.
And I'm gonna keep working on these eggs until we've got them to a nice stiff peak stage.
Okay, John, now that we've faded through black, literally and figuratively, we have to take these 3 components and fold them into whichever bowl is the biggest.
I think this one's the biggest.
We offer these birchwood wooden whisks on our website. They're handmade, and professional chefs prefer whisks like this even today for certain purposes.
One of the interesting things about this piece is that it is an egg leavened cake. And egg leavening is one of the leavening types that you see in 18th century cooking. You don't see what we would use in a cake today, which is, of course, chemical leavening. So this is the kind of cake that they would have made. And now we're going to fold in this flour a little bit at a time. And we really have to keep moving. We're losing the air bubbles even as we speak.
There we go. We have this beautiful, light, and airy batter. It's amazing. It has such a wonderful texture to it.
And now in go the sweetmeats, or in this case, we're gonna fold this into the sweetmeats.
Right, right. You're gonna need a big bowl for this. Okay, that is such a it's a light, airy batter, and we need to be careful about stirring that too hard or we'll beat that air out of there. Our hoop is ready. That's ready. We need marry the two, so to speak.
Now, the recipe says to put this immediately in the oven. We're gonna put this in at 350 degrees for about 2 hours.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah, it looks wonderful. It's even risen over the top. So
Yeah.
you didn't shape this, it came up over the top. And if you see those period illustrations, you'll see that very thing happening, that the cake is sort of mounded up in the center.
Right.
There we go. Oh, look at that.
Oh, look at
The
that.
Paper,
Just came right off.
Came right off.
Oh my
It
goodness.
looks perfect. I say let's slice into this and see what it's really like.
All right, let's do it.
Well, it looks perfect on the inside. It's got a great coloration.
Oh wow. And it tastes the lemon.
Excellent. Yeah. Everything's coming through wonderfully.
And the almonds.
All that fruit in there.
Wow.
This recipe is so wonderful. It's full of flavors. It's great, and I hope you get a chance to try it. It makes a wonderful holiday cake, and I hope everyone out there has a wonderful, happy 12th night.
And a Merry Christmas.
What is Christmas to a poor man 300 years ago? Is it a mountain of food and presents? Is it going outside and shooting off your guns in celebration? Or is it a day just like any other? In this time period, there were several different ways to celebrate Christmas, and they were very diverse. It really depended on your cultural and religious background. Christmas is a very religious holiday, and there are very different ideas on the ways to celebrate Christmas. In the American colonies, it really depended on where you were from in England or other parts of the world. If you were somebody who was maybe in the London area, and you had an Anglican background, your Christmas is a bit more what we think of as a traditional Christmas celebration. You're going to celebrate it at Christmas time, maybe a little bit after, for as many as 2 weeks. You're going to have meals, you're going to have people visiting you, you will have presents. A classic Christmas. But that's just a small portion of the people in the American colonies. If you lived in the Northeast, maybe the Boston area, but your ancestors were from East Anglia, your Christmas tradition was very restricted. It was almost like the Puritans had a war against celebrating Christmas. The Christmas idea, that's all right. But the idea of taking time and celebrating Christmas, maybe having special celebrations, they didn't like that at all. In the 17th century, before our time period, they even had basically outlawed Christmas. They had fines if you celebrated Christmas. When I think about the fines, I think, now wait a minute, you don't really do that unless people want to break the law. So obviously in the Northeast, there were people who wanted to celebrate Christmas, but they had laws against it. If you were from Philadelphia and you had a Quaker background, well, the Quakers were against special religious holidays altogether, and they ignored them. They worked on Christmas just like it was any other day. During the mid to late 18th century, there is a very strong influx of Scots-Irish into the North American colonies. And they've got a completely different idea. They are definitely not Anglican like the people that come into the Virginia area say. They have a very Protestant and Presbyterian way of thinking about it. But they are actually fairly strong with their Christmas traditions. But their Christmas is a little different. It has to do a lot with celebrating, let's go out and fire some guns, let's have a party, maybe let's wrestle, let's have some fun on Christmas. And finally, if you're in the New York area, there's a very, very strong Dutch and German influence in that area. And they were also very into Christmas decorations, they were into celebratory things, confectionery, and special Christmas dishes. Now, they influence those people around them. And as we go through the 18th century, more and more of these people that do celebrate Christmas start to influence the people that aren't interested in Christmas. So as we go through the 18th century, Christmas becomes more important in North America. But what about Christmas for the poor person? Which one of these categories do they fit into? And here it, of course, is any one of those. Christmas is special for the poor in the 18th century. It is a time for people that are better off to give to the poor, and we see that a lot in research. We see people that are maybe leaving things in bequests in wills, and they'll say to be given to the poor at Christmas. Maybe they'll even set aside something like a trust. What about the poorest of the poor? When we look into the practices in the workhouses, we find that Christmas is a special day. Here's a workhouse. It says, on Christmas, the paupers are allowed roast mutton, plum pudding, the best cheese, and ale. Looking for examples of poorer people in these circumstances of Christmas, I ran onto a couple of readings about Lewis and Clark. And Lewis and Clark expedition is going out here in 1804, 1805, and there are Christmas things happening. Now, probably most of the folks along on that expedition are more Scots-Irish. They're the people who want to go out and have a celebration and kick up some dust. So what happened on the first Christmas during the expedition? Here we go. Some snow fell this morning about 10. It cleared up. The weather became pleasant. This evening we finished our fortification. Flour, dried apples, pepper, and other articles were distributed in the different messes to enable them to celebrate Christmas in a proper and social manner. Tuesday the 25th. The morning was ushered in by 2 discharges of the swivel cannon and a round of small arms fire by the whole corps. And then each man was presented with a glass of brandy, and we hoisted the American flag in the garrison. Now the second Christmas, well, this is on the way back from the coast, and they are out of supplies. So this is a very different Christmas. This morning we left our camp and moved into our huts. At daybreak, all the men paraded and fired a round of small arms, wishing the commanding officers a Merry Christmas. In the course of the day, Captain Lewis and Captain Clark collected what tobacco remained and divided it amongst those who used tobacco as a Christmas gift. To the others, they gave handkerchiefs in lieu of that. We had no spirituous liquor to elevate our spirits this Christmas, but of this we had but little need, as we were all in very good health. Rich or poor, what are the standard Christmas dishes? What's the most popular thing to eat in Christmas in the 18th century? Well, boiled puddings. Those plum puddings that we see, those are the quintessential dish, even in the poorhouse. Also, roast meat, whether it's roast mutton, roast beef, a roast chicken, a roast goose, or a turkey, all are popular for dishes on Christmas Day. And a Christmas pie is also very, very popular, and most of the time a Christmas pie here in the 18th century was a mincemeat pie. Mincemeat pie with real meat, or maybe if you're poorer, maybe a mincemeat pie without actual meat in it. And that brings me to the idea of all of these dishes. Each one of these we could make a very rich version or a very poor version. As we dig into the cookbooks, we see that very thing going on. Each one of these recipes, we will see a poor version and a rich version. We can make a plum pudding or the classic boiled pudding, and we can put very expensive ingredients in it. We can put brandy in it. We can fill it with cream and eggs to make this extra special, huge boiled pudding. Or we can make a very meager version where just water and flour and a little suet and a few raisins go into this pudding, and we can make a very poor version. One of the things that did seem to be special about Christmas was that it was a time to take off, even if you were a poor person, or in the worst situation possible, if you were in jail doing heavy labor. And that was something that was happening in the early 19th century. But Christmas Day was one of the only days you had off, that you did not have to labor hard. And even poor people, even depending on different situations here and different cultures, Christmas was one of those days that you had as a day off. As we progress through the 18th century and the early 19th century, we do get different ideas about how to deal with the poor, both in Great Britain and North America. People do want to solve this problem because there's a lot more poor people as we go through this time period. People are writing books about it, and they're coming up with ideas like workhouses and the poorhouses, and they want a solution for this. But it all seems to come together at this idea of Christmas. And even if they're creating a workhouse where they're trying to make these people work all year, Christmas is the one day that they have off. And Christmas is the one day that they get a special meal. It's like they want to give them at least one day where they can forget that they're poor. It's interesting that the classic Christmas story that we all know, which is Dickens' A Christmas Carol, he's actually hearkening back to exactly this time period. England in the 1790s, maybe 1800. That's when he thinks the classic Christmas happens. And it had kind of sunken. Christmas wasn't as important, but it gets to Dickens's time, and he revives the idea of Christmas and points back to that classic Christmas of about 1800. As we look at the Cratchit family, we see that poor Christmas going on there. They still want it to be festive, and they take the whole day and make special dishes. They have the Christmas pudding, we have the roast bird, maybe we even have the mince pie in there hidden someplace, but they're taking a time, they're decorating, they're having a poor man's Christmas. Welcome to 18th Century Cooking. I'm your host, John Townsend, and we have a special holiday episode. We're going to be doing a Christmas goose. That ought to be spectacular and fun. Thanks for joining us today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. Goose is mentioned in a lot of the 18th century cookbooks. We're going to pick out this one. This is the English Art of Cookery by Richard Briggs. This is 1788 English cookbook. A great one, chock full of just really great recipes. The goose recipe is pretty simple. Some of them do something like they'll give you directions for a turkey and then say, oh yeah, do a goose like that. This one's specifically for goose, which is kind of nice. It's definitely goose. It's definitely different than trying to do this with a turkey or a chicken. The goose we've got to work with here is a pretty smallish goose. I'm not sure exactly how big theirs were in the time period, but I'm guessing that even in a time period fashion, this would be a smaller goose. We're supposed to truss this goose up. Pick it and wash it. We chop a dozen sage leaves, 2 large onions, some salt, pepper, and put them inside the bird. Then we put it down to the fire and we baste it. Sprinkle some salt on. We dredge it with flour, so we put flour over the top of it. It says a large goose will take an hour and a half, a small one about 1 hour. When it's done, baste it with butter, dredge it with a little more flour, and then it has directions for serving it to the table. And we'll cover that when we get done with this bird. So this bird we have already cleaned, got the vast majority of feathers off this. These geese can be very difficult to get all the feathers off. It's so nice when we go to grocery store today and all our chickens are perfectly plucked. This one is off the farm, so it's we've got our own troubles to go with it, but we've basically cut off all the parts that we don't need for the roasting of it. And let me get this salt and pepper, these onions chopped up, put inside the bird, and we'll tie it up so we can hang it by the fire. I've got enough of our onions and sage to basically fill the cavity up here, although this is again, there's not a ton of meat on a bird like this. They're actually pretty hollow. There's a big cavity in here. So let's put some onions in here first. And then we'll put some salt and pepper in. And I'm just going to kind of put these in layers. Salt and pepper. Let's put a little bit of sage in there. And we really want to have this cavity filled with something kind of like this. And I think that this is going to actually help it in a couple of different ways, along with the flavor of these onions, the salt and the pepper, sort of seasoning it from the inside out. So it'll be, I can't wait to try it. Sometimes birds are just seasoned on the inside with butter and salt and pepper. Goose is a naturally darker meat bird, so it probably doesn't need as much of the butter on the inside. This particular recipe doesn't call for any butter on the inside. Last little bit of salt and pepper. That looks really good. Now we just need to tie this bird up so that we can hang it by the fire. And what we're really just trying to do is both have a way to hang the bird and also to keep these the wings and the legs inside so they don't get burned. So step one, let's do this. I'm going to do this in a couple of different tie-offs because it's hard to do in one single throw here. I'm going to get these legs together. Just a simple square knot's going to hold those legs together, but I want to bring this whole tail end up all together. Okay, so that looks good. Now, the wings. There we go, that'll hold that together. Now we need to have sort of a fully surrounding piece so that we can hang this bird and it continues to hold everything together so it'll cook nice and evenly all the way around. So we've got our bird strung up, and it's kind of at an angle to accept the heat as best it can. This method works really good for a campfire or a fireplace that doesn't have a lot of equipment, or if you don't have a reflector oven or whatever it takes. So it's a nice simple method, but it does take a little extra time because we can't get it quite as close. And if we want to catch drippings, which is always difficult with an open fire like this because it wants to burn our drippings away, we have to kind of build the fire up to one side and make it a little vertical. So I used a couple of fire bricks here to help make the fire higher, because it's always easy to cook things directly from the bottom, but not easy to cook it to the side. That's why a reflector oven would really help in this situation. So I'm keeping the fire up nice and high, letting this cook down. We do put, as this bird cooks, the fat from inside the skin kind of comes to the outside. We're supposed to keep a little bit of flour going on the outside of it, dredge it with flour. We don't need to butter it. That's one of the things that's kind of nice about this goose. There's so much fat under the skin, so it butters itself. And we're just gonna keep rotating this very slowly over the fire. If we have one little string here, we can wind it kind of up. We don't want it to spin fast, but nice and slow. It doesn't take very often that you need to kind of touch it, and it will keep slowly rotating. As the bottom cooks, because there's more heat at the bottom, we have to turn the bird over and kind of cook it for the other side. Occasionally you gotta kind of feel it, see if it's cooking everywhere. We might have to alter that string just a little bit. Again, we're gonna cook this. It might take, in this circumstance, a little bit longer because it's hard to get really close to the fire since it's on its string. Well, we garnished this up just like it called for, which is some beets and some lemons. So we got some red and yellow in there. We got to put a little kale in there with some green. We're supposed to have gravy underneath the goose, and we made some gravies out of some of that, the drippings that came off of that, and it smelled tremendous. While it's cooking, a lot of those flavors or a lot of those smells go right up the chimney, but now that it's off the fire, whoa, you get all that great, wonderful smell. So let's give this a try. Gravy is wonderful, that's for sure. And you could see as I was carving this, that it's a dark meat bird, right? Like a duck. It's not anything like a chicken or a turkey with all this white meat on top. No, it's all dark meat. And of course, I really enjoy that. Not nearly so dry. So a nice tender meat. Although, a smaller bird like this, and especially a farmyard bird, they can be a little tougher to work with. So you got to kind of be used to that. Definitely a totally different experience than what we're used to. Chicken, turkey, totally different and very, very wonderful. Just you gotta try out something like this. If you can't find a goose, try a duck. If you can find those, usually those aren't nearly so hard to find, and probably almost as big as the one we were cooking here. Would be a great substitute. We've been talking about this one for so long, a Christmas goose. I'm so glad we were able to get it done for this season, and spectacular looking, amazing smells, wonderful flavors. So glad we were able to give this one a try. If you can't find a goose, look for a duck. Try this out. You can, roast it like we did over and over open fire, or you can do it in your oven at home. So wonderful. Try it out for Christmas. Chestnuts roasting on an open fire. We've all heard this song. We've probably all sang along with the song. The question is, have we ever tried roasted chestnuts? I certainly have not. Our special guest, Michael Dragoo, has brought in chestnuts for us, and we are going to try that out. Tell us about roasted chestnuts.
Sure. Chestnuts have been roasted for a long time. I had a hard time finding a dated recipe going back to this time, and I think it's just so obvious a thing to do that no one ever wrote them down. Like today they write down recipes that are kind of extravagant or hard. This is so simple and everybody was doing it. We had a blight that took out most of our American chestnuts. Today were you to order chestnuts, you can still get American chestnuts. These are American chestnuts, but 80% of the chestnuts purchased in the world are from China. The other 20% are from Italy. You can get them from France and from other countries, but predominantly they are other chestnuts. They're related to lots of things. These little guys are one nut. There are some other chestnuts, I think the Chinese chestnuts in that shell might be 2 or 3 nuts. What we're gonna do is we're gonna cut the shell so it expands, so it doesn't explode, and we're just gonna roast them over an open fire. They're gonna get softened and we're going to enjoy their little innards.
Yeah, I think the reason why you wouldn't see them in a recipe book is because, I mean, it is the recipe, right? Roast the chestnuts. What recipe is there about it? Other than the simple direction of, cut the shell, which I don't think anybody, since everybody was eating them, they probably seen the finished product, and so they wouldn't bother to write it down.
Right. You can buy chestnut roasters, pans with holes in their bottoms. I have a early 1800s copper chestnut roaster from England that's meant to steam the chestnuts, or it's a roaster, you could steam lots of things in it. But we're predominantly today, when I try to find original recipes, they're just in a pan, heating up over a fire. And that's what we're gonna try.
Chestnuts roasting on an open fire. In the song, it's called the Christmas song. Are these directly related to Christmas?
Only in that it's a late harvested produce, and they have a short shelf life once they're produced, so you consume them right away.
Right around Christmas time.
Yes.
That's when they're ready.
Yep. To prepare these for roasting, I soaked these for about a half an hour. You can soak them up to 24 hours. You're doing two things. You're trying to soften the outer shell so it's easier to cut, but you're also trying to introduce water into the chestnut, because they're not just roasting on the open fire. It takes something besides that external heat, so you've got to be steaming from within. And now we're just cutting through the shells. There's an outer shell, and then there's a membrane inside, and we're trying to cut through both of them without slicing our thumbs off. This is an adult watching an older child project, not a young child project.
These little outer shells are tough. It's no wonder. If you don't slice them, what happens?
They explode.
Yeah, so you don't want to do that. So you definitely have to slice.
No, and they explode with enough velocity that they can take out your oven light or perhaps crack your glass.
Okay.
They take
Make
off.
sure to slice your chestnuts. So this is surprising. It wasn't as easy as I thought it was going to be.
We had 3 batches here. The first batch I didn't put in a cloth to steam once I pulled them out of the pan.
Right.
They were very difficult.
Yeah.
They resisted all attempts
Right.
to peel
So,
nicely.
There's the outer husk, there's the inner kind of skin.
Yeah, it's a fibrous kind of thing.
That inner skin, unless it's still moist and still warm, it just doesn't want to separate from that inner sort of the nut proper.
itself, right.
And you don't want to eat that.
No,
Skin is not
it's
good.
bitter.
It's not good. So
And then the other 2 batches we steamed, and they peeled much easier.
Right.
It's important to cut not only through the outer shell, and it's difficult. I don't know how to do it right. I don't have any tools. I just used a paring knife. But you got to cut through that membrane too, because if you do, and if you cook them till they're soft, and then if you let them steam in a cloth, it all comes off together. And they peeled rather nicely.
but you still have to peel them when they're almost hot.
Yeah,
It's hot enough you
almost too hot to touch. but
Right.
You're right on the hairy edge.
and then they peel.
But I like them. I've never had a taste like this before. I can't tell you any other nut that it tastes like exactly.
Yeah.
And
well,
it's
I want to
soft.
try it out.
Yeah.
So a little bit of salt was kind of it's better with that, right?
I preferred them when I did them at home
Okay,
with a
so
little
let's
salt.
try this out. So I'm trying to figure out what this nut tastes like, and it
It's kind of creamy. It's not strong nutty.
Definitely. no,
It's sweet.
Very
I think,
sweet.
compared to walnuts and other
but
holiday
there's
nuts.
nothing that really comes right to mind. But we don't normally. Well, I guess we do have like hot peanuts, right? Other
Yeah.
things that we cook, nuts that we cook.
Yeah.
But this has got a completely soft texture, almost like slightly too hard mashed potatoes. You know how mashed potatoes kind of have that, if you don't cook them quite enough, there's a little texture there. So they have that, and it's a good texture.
They're very mild.
And they're mild, they're sweet, but they don't say, you don't think, oh, that's just like some other nut, right?
Right,
they're
right.
totally, they're chestnuts. They're not anything else.
I can't tell you what they did to perk them up in our time period. But modern research, when I was just researching how to get the things out of the shells, they're using oils and butters. They're infusing them with herbs, with spices.
Oh, for extra flavor?
For
or
extra
whatever?
flavor,
Yeah.
right. It could be tarragon. It's
I don't think they need anything else.
I think these are fine, but they do have a drizzle that you could drizzle on. And in one case, I read that they soaked them in wine before they cooked them in the first place. I didn't try that.
So-
But
Yeah. I could definitely see them as a street food, but you would get them right out of the roaster. You know, they probably give them to you just a little warm,
Right.
and then you would eat them quickly while they were still warm, or else you wouldn't be able to get them apart.
I think it's really important to soak them ahead of time. And maybe I didn't soak them long enough. We soaked them for maybe 45 minutes this afternoon before we introduced them to the skillet. And it's possible they should have absorbed more water and been in there longer. They were kind of tough to cut. I don't think I cut them through enough because of this. Proper ones, the whole thing peeled back.
I don't know. Sometimes it worked. I
Yep.
mean, even when it was,
Yep.
you just can't let them get cold, or else you can't peel them.
Right.
Yeah. So this one it just doesn't work.
And I can't weigh in. There were some instances where people recommended to just slice it
Halfway.
halfway.
Right.
We elected to do the cross because more people, from what I read, did them that way. I can't tell you which is easier or better.
Yeah.
I don't think we soaked them enough, and I think we peeled them when they were starting to get cool. I think those two things made it difficult for us because the ones that were almost too hot to touch peeled. That's where we got these successful ones from.
Yeah.
And they look great. I think they taste good.
Yeah.
So, success?
I think they're very successful. I wish we still had plenty of chestnuts to eat, but we don't around here.
Yep.
It would be something pretty prolific. Chestnut trees were very, very common, and you would have lots of chestnuts
Yeah.
to eat. So we've all heard the Christmas song. This is what they're talking about, and it's wonderful. It's a great opportunity to get a chance to eat something that they would have had very, very commonly in the 18th century. So thank you so much, Michael, for bringing that in.
welcome.
Oh, and Michael's new cookbook is out. Make sure to check it out. It's on the website, and it's a tremendous way of kind of talking about and understanding how we connect with history, not just, thinking about it 200 years ago, but our personal history, our ancestry that goes back to that kind of time. How do we connect with those ancestors from 200 years ago? Food is a great way of doing that, understanding food. So great job on that cookbook.
Thank you so much.
Make sure to check that out. Thank you so much for joining us today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. Christmas is very soon, Ivy.
Oh, I'm so excited.
So you like Christmas, huh?
Yeah, it's my favorite holiday.
Is it really now? Why do you like Christmas so much? It's your turn. Is it the presents?
Yes, and the Christmas tree and the food. Grammy.
Really? The food? What kind of food do you like?
What kind of food do I not like?
Oh, gosh.
It's your turn.
I've been wanting to make a special dish that was a favorite for Christmas for hundreds of years.
Really? What is it?
I want to make a mince pie using an old recipe from Elizabeth Raffald's 1769 cookbook, The Experienced English Housekeeper.
Oh, the experienced housekeeper. Can I help?
Well, let's clean up.
So what is mince pie, Dad?
It usually has lots of raisins in it. It's got nice tart apples. It has brandy. Sometimes it even has a little meat in it. And of course, spices.
What kind of meat?
Well, they usually have something that has a very smooth grain to it. So tongue or tenderloin.
Cow tongue? I like cow tongue.
Yeah, I know. You're a funny little girl, aren't you?
Are we going to use cow tongue?
Not in this recipe. This particular recipe is a meatless mince pie.
So how do we make it?
Well, we need to start with about a pound of currants and about a half a pound of raisins.
What are currants?
Currants are kind of like little tiny raisins.
Then why don't we just use raisins?
Well, you can use raisins instead of currants if you can't find them in your grocery store. Let's get these mixed up. Let's pour them out, and what we need to do is chop all these down into a very minced up form. Doing it this old-fashioned way, it might take up to a half an hour to get these all minced up in their tiny little form. But if you're in a more modern kitchen, well, you can use a food processor, and it will only take a minute or two. So, here are our raisins and currants all chopped up. To this, we're going to add about a pound of our finely minced apple that we need to chop up the same kind of way. And then we have about 4 ounces of candied orange peel. I'll put that in here too. And then we have about a half a cup of regular white sugar.
Can I mix it up, Dad?
Not yet. First, we need to add some spices. We've got a teaspoon of cinnamon, a half a teaspoon of nutmeg, and a 1/4 teaspoon of clove, all ground up. And then we have 4 ounces of this brandy that we need to put in here. So let's put these all in too. There we go. Now we can mix it up. That's hard, isn't it?
It's sticky.
Here, let me give it a try. You're gonna really get that stuff off the bottom, get it all mixed up. The last thing we need to add to this is the suet.
Suet? What's that? Is that what we feed the birds in the winter?
Yes, suet is a special hard kind of fat that comes from the kidney area of cows and sheep. It not only makes the pie much more moist, but it also gives it an interesting texture.
Are we going to use suet?
No, we're not going to use real suet today in this recipe because suet can be very hard to find in the United States. If you ask your local butcher, he might be able to keep some suet out for you, or you might be able to order some online, but today we're going to use a substitute. about 10 ounces of vegetable shortening that we froze and then we grated. Let's just dump this in and get it mixed in.
It looks like butter.
Okay, this is all mixed up. This is our mincemeat ready to go. Now it's time to put it in our pie shell. What we're going to be using today is a puff paste.
I saw that video.
This puff paste has been rolled out pretty thin, about 1/8 of an inch, and I've got a bottom and a top right here. Let's put our mincemeat in here. We've prepared enough for about 2 pies this size, so we'll only use about half of this.
When will it be ready to eat?
Well, first we're going to have to bake it, and this pie will need to bake in a modern oven about an hour at 375, or until nice and golden brown. We're going to bake this in our earthen oven. You could also bake it in a Dutch oven.
Well, it's cooking. I feel in the mood to decorate. Is this ready?
Yep, it's ready. This pie you can eat hot or cold.
I think we should eat it now.
Okay, let's cut it up. There's your piece. Here's mine. Let's give it a little taste. Here's your knife. Wow. That is great. Oh, you want to try the crust. Yeah. How's that puff paste?
I can't get it.
You got it. Is that good? Sweet, but it's not too sweet. It's got a nice texture. It's very moist. Really, really good. Welcome to 18th Century Cooking. I'm your host, John Townsend. I've got a special guest, Ivy, in the kitchen with me today. We'll be experimenting. We'll be trying to make wafers. Thanks for joining us today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. So we've got Ivy with us today. Ivy, are you excited about getting ready for Christmas? Yeah, so we're gonna make Christmas wafers. Well, let's hope we can make Christmas wafers. The wafer recipes that show up in the 18th century, they're all very similar. They're like a thin-ish pancake batter, right? So the problem is that most people do not have, I haven't heard anyone have good luck actually cooking them. And so many people will modify the recipe. They'll like make kind of a cookie dough and squeeze it between there and make wafer-like things, but they're not the wafer recipes that they show up in the 18th century. Now, this cookbook here is the Cooks and Confectioners Dictionary of John Knott. I think it's 1723, something like that. It's an early 18th century cookbook. It's got 4 recipes. 4 wafers in it, 4 different recipes, and they're all very similar. And here's the first one as an example. Put the yolks of 4 eggs on and 3 spoonfuls of rose water to a quart of flour, mingle them well, make them into batter with cream and double refined sugar, pour it on very thin and bake it on irons. So it's a rich recipe. Egg yolks, not just eggs. It's got rose water. That's an expensive aromatic that you're putting in there. It's got flour, and it's got cream instead of milk, and double refined sugar. That means white sugar, not a brown sugar. But the fun part of this recipe is it says bake it on irons. That's it. That's it for the technique, which is what everybody has trouble with. Making the batter is nothing. Anybody can do that. So here's the second recipe. If you can see this, there's the first recipe. It's just like 3 lines, 4 lines long. Here's the next recipe. It's half the page. And it's a very similar recipe at the beginning, but the last 3/4 of that giant page of text is about how to do it. So that's what we have to learn, not making the recipe, but how do we actually make these wafers?
So the ingredients we're going to be using today are a pint of cream, 2 egg yolks, and probably around a cup of flour, and a half a cup of white sugar. And the first thing we're going to do is mix our wet ingredients.
So let's start getting this mixed up. We're going to start off with our wet ingredients. Here, you go ahead and take this because you're going to do all that hard work. We just want the egg yolks. There you go. You can whisk that up. Very nice.
Add the cream in.
Yeah, so we've got a pint of cream. You know it's going to be good if it's got a pint of cream in there. Whisk that up very nicely. Now that that's, whisked up enough, I mean, we really probably want that a lot more whisked up, but we'll let Ivy keep going on that. Then we're going to put in some sugar. Off you go. Now, many of these recipes had the aromatic rose water or orange flower water shows up. Also, now today we wouldn't use something like that, but if we did want something similar, we would add in a little bit of vanilla, and that gives us our aromatic. We might add a little bit of orange flower water for the fun of it, but I'm not so sure.
Is that about good?
Yeah, that's gonna start going. Just keep on whisking. I'm gonna add flour in as we go. And again, we don't know exactly how much flour. Most of these recipes do not have amounts. They're very sort of add these two things together. So we're just gonna add flour in until we get to the right kind of consistency.
What's the consistency that we're looking for?
Well, some of the recipes call for a very thin batter. Other ones call for something like a pancake batter, and then they add more things to thin it out a little bit. So, but of course, we don't know exactly what their pancake batter thickness is. Ours tends to be kind of a fairly thick batter, but we're gonna go for something, we're gonna shoot for something pretty thin. Well, it's pretty thick. It's probably thicker than what they called for, and I don't want to cheat and make this too thick. I want to make it exactly like the directions as much as possible. So we're going to add a little bit of water in here to thin it up. Some of the later recipes, the almost 19th century recipes, say to have a little warm water set aside that you can add in to thin it. So you don't want it to be too thick. These recipes are great fun to read. They're hilarious. One of these recipes is like, well, mix the cream in the flour and then add more cream and then add more cream later on. So they're always fun. And we are definitely looking for something that, as it splashes up onto the sides, you can see, you can kind of get an idea of how smooth the texture is. And we want a very, very smooth texture on this. So and sometimes it says to beat this a long time. And that's just to get everything smooth, not necessarily to beat air into it, because we don't actually want it to bubble a whole bunch. We want it to be a smooth wafer. Well, the consistency looks right, so it needs to sit a little bit. Actually, though, there's one thing that's missing. This is an 18th century recipe. Most of the recipes, well, 2 of the recipes out of the 4, one had mace and the other one had nutmeg.
Well, you have to put the nutmeg in.
Right, so we're gonna, and I think, boy, one of them, it was like a half on nutmeg. They wanted a lot of nutmeg in there to go along, and it is an aromatic too, just like that orange flower water in the rose water. There we go. And you can whisk that in, and then we'll let this kind of set, get smoother, kind of settle down a little bit. Now comes the tricky part. We have to get the irons ready. We got to get the fire ready so that we can start to cook them. So here is the irons that we're going to be baking in, and they've got this nice design in them. This is actually an old set of wafer irons, probably from the late 18th century, early 19th century. It's been cleaned up here so that we can use them. Beautiful design on the inside, nice heavy platters to hold that heat. And the interesting thing I think about this, one of the things about this recipe is that it is an expensive recipe in that it's got expensive ingredients. It's got expensive equipment that you have to have so that you can bake them. And they're something that takes some finesse, some real time to bake. So these are obviously something for a fancy household because of expensive ingredients, expensive equipment, and all the time it takes to make these fun little wafers. So I'm gonna get this on the fire to start warming up. They need to be probably around 350 degrees hot before we start to put the batter in. The recipe also calls for a simple small ball of butter inside of the corner of a napkin to help butter your irons. Our wafer iron is almost up to heat. You would think you'd just pour that batter on there and everything would turn out all right, but that's not what I've heard, so let's read the directions. Having your wafer iron ready heated, rub on both sides from time to time with fresh butter put into the corner of your napkin. So that's what we got here. Turn the batter upon the iron, not exceeding 1.5 spoons for every wafer. Lay the wafer iron on a furnace. Now what we got here is a little trivet to hold that just over our coals, which would be like a little furnace or a little stove, sometimes it's referred to here. So that when the wafer is baked on one side, it may be turned upon the other. Open the iron a little and observe. If it come to a good color, it is enough. At that instant, you don't want it to burn, right? Take off the wafer from the iron with a knife, rolling it a little around the same. Then, last of all, spread the wafers hot upon a wooden roller made for the purpose to shape them and set them in a stove so that they may be finished and that they may be kept dry. So it's very complex, isn't it? It can't be that hard, right? So we're going to figure this out. We've got our wafer iron up to heat, and we're going to try spooning some of this on there and start to get these guys cooking. Oh, okay.
That's not gonna work.
So, I don't know if you could get more of a failure than that. It didn't do anything. There's nothing left. It all just boiled away. So, okay, that isn't gonna work.
Nope.
Now what? Okay, so I got what was left of that wafer off of there. I think it was too hot. And of course, the first time you try to cook one of these and you got too much butter on there, that's a problem too. So, I'll let these cool off just a little bit, and Ivy, come in. Let's try another one right now. Okay, that's good. Okay. Well, there's more of it left than there was last time, but
yeah.
But it's. I mean, that...
It's kind of gooey.
That's not a wafer.
No, that's not a wafer.
That's like a lace doily. So, okay, that's not going to work.
Nope.
So we could try thickening the batter, but that would be cheating. So we're going to let this cool down a little bit more, and maybe I'm not going to like slam it closed right away. So go ahead and let's try some in it, and then wait a second. Although the directions don't say that. Okay, so let's wait and see what happens.
Yes.
And now I'm going to try it over the fire. So that one was slightly better. The doily was a little thicker, but obviously we're not there yet. It feels to me like maybe it's the pressure that is squishing all the material
You just
out.
need to barely lay it on there.
So I think that's what I'm going to try. Maybe this time. That's good. Whoa, whoa, whoa. Not too much. I'm just going to gently put it on the fire. Just slowly do it. Oh,
Oh, that's beautiful.
Well, 2 hours later, and I think we've got it figured out. It took a lot of trial and error on this, and it seems to me that, I mean, it almost seems like it's just time. You just have to spend a whole bunch of time, and I'll bet you every time we'd come to this, the first half an hour, you think, what? It's not working, it's not working. And you just keep working at it. I think part of it is the batter rusting. And part of it is the irons getting into the groove and you getting into the groove exactly how much time it takes. I guess the real trick is to put that batter in there and not close them up real quick. Let them kind of slightly cook for a second. And then when you close it, you very gently close it. Because if you squeeze it at all, it just squeezes out and turns into
Lace
the
doily.
doily. So let's try them out.
Yeah.
They look great, so let's try them out. We got a little bit of whipped cream. We got a little bit of jam here, and I'm gonna try mine without any first.
I can pick this up here.
Reminds me of a modern vanilla wafers, right?
Right.
Although there's no vanilla in here, I think it's that egg flavor. You get. I don't know if this one had very much nutmeg in it. Let me find one that I know had lots of nutmeg. Might have to add some to our thing with a little bit of whipped cream. Oh wow! With the topping, they're tremendous. And
That jam is.
well, holiday preserves, whipped topping. They're fun. They certainly are a fancy little thing, perfect for the holidays. I'm not sure how you would do them in a modern kitchen without a set of irons.
Yeah.
But they're so much fun, and they look really neat. If you're interested in this cookbook, this John Knott's cookbook, I think this is the one that had fried chicken in it too. Amazing cookbook from early 18th century with a lot of different kinds of recipe. It's a little bit harder to read. It's got earlier text font style, but it's still such a tremendous cookbook. This one's available on our website. You can make sure to check out the description. Ivy, thanks for doing all that work with the whipping it up and trying these out. Of course, everybody wants to stick around for the end to try them out,
Yeah.
so thank you for that. Thank you guys for coming along as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. Christmas is one of my family's favorite times of year. It's a wonderful holiday, you know, lots of decorations, special food, special traditions. And I so want that to be true for colonial America in the 18th century, you know, 1775, and what are they doing for Christmas? And we can kind of envision this. We can put our Christmas and kind of plug it into colonial America and think it's wonderful, but it's just not there. You know, you do the research and Christmas is something completely different. Not anything like what we would expect for colonial Christmas. We can't just take our Christmas and plug it in to 250 years ago because it doesn't work. Here are the books that tell us some about what Christmas is like in colonial America. First, Thomas Turner's diary. He's not in America, he's in Sussex, England. And he writes about Christmas, and yeah, they go and they visit people on Christmas. It's more about visiting. It's, not necessarily special food, but it's going around and maybe parties, right? In fact, about February 7th, in one of the years, he says, "Whew, Christmas season's finally over. We can stop visiting people," because he's talking about being an introvert, not wanting to go do all that visiting. Matthew Patton's diary. He's in New Hampshire, and he's writing in the middle of the century from 1754 to 1788. And so in New England, he is very particular. This is his daybook diary about what he does for business. And, we can go to a typical December 25th, and let's see, December 25th, I attended at Colonel Joff's on a case. I sued Ebenezer Farley, but he did not appear. He was in court. They had court on December 25th. That's just, we wouldn't connect that at all. It's other days on December 25th, he's making parts for shoes, or, he's taking grain to the mill. That's not Christmas, right? We can get a lot of ideas, but sometimes we need to find somebody who's really going to explain it to us. So, Peter Kalm, he's from Sweden. He comes to America, and he's going to explain things back to people in Sweden. Well, he's really helpful because he can explain stuff to us 250 years later. So let me see if I can find the page here. He writes about Christmas two different places. He writes this on January 5th. He says, "Christmas Day was celebrated today, January 5th, by the Swedes and the English, for they still use the old calendar." So there's a calendar thing going on in the middle of the 18th century. There's like a 10-day shift. Anyway, members of the English church hardly make any bigger preparations for Christmas than for any Sunday. When it came on a weekday, it was not celebrated any more than the Swedish Apostles' Day. The Quakers paid still less attention to it, for since they observe no other holiday except Sunday, they work on Christmas Day just as on any other day unless it comes on a Sunday. He writes about it in one more place, and here he says, "There was no baking of bread for the Christmas festival, no Christmas porridge on Christmas Eve." Christmas porridge. I love that idea. "One did not seem to know what it meant to wish another one Merry Christmas. However, I have heard several members of the English church wish one another a happy Christmas holiday." There we go. A couple of quick ideas about what's going on with Christmas. One of these other books said, well, Christmas is hardly ever really celebrated by any other than the Dutch. So we know that the Dutch or the immigrants, Dutch immigrants, are the ones that are the most likely to celebrate Christmas. Well, thankfully, we do have someone who helps us a little bit and gives us some Christmas tradition. This is Amelia Simmons' American Cookery Cookbook. It's done right at the end of the 18th century, 1796. She's from that New York area. It does have a Dutch influence in the cooking, and she gives us a recipe for another Christmas cookie. So, we do have something for Christmas. We can finally make something that gives us an idea for colonial Christmas. So let's make another Christmas cookie. So this recipe is really important. This cookbook is really important for several different reasons. But this one's titled Another Christmas Cookie. It's funny because it doesn't say, like the one above it doesn't say Christmas cookies. It says cookies. And then it says another Christmas cookies. Like, well, Christmas is the only time you make cookies. I guess, maybe, it's hard to say. She doesn't explain that completely. Another really important thing here is this is the first cookbook that I know of, English cookbook, that shows up with chemical leavening. Something that makes your cookies light and fluffy with a chemical instead of using yeast, or maybe, you might leaven it with something like eggs that you whip up. But nope, this uses chemical leavening, and that's definitely a Dutch tradition that does not show up in English cookbooks in the 18th century at all, ever. So here we've got that. Let's read the recipe for another Christmas cookie. 2-3 pounds of flour, so add 2-3 pounds of flour. Sprinkle a teacup of fine powdered coriander seed. Rub in 1 pound of butter and 1.5 pounds of sugar. Dissolve 3 teaspoonfuls of pearl ash. That's our chemical leavening. Pearl ash in a teacup of milk. Knead all it well together. Roll 3/4 of an inch thick. That's massive. We're not going to do it that thick. And cut or stamp into shape or size you please. So there's this idea of decorating. Bake slowly 15 or 20 minutes. Though hard and dry at first, the cookies, if you put in an earthen pot and a dry cellar or a damp room, they will be finer and softer and better when 6 months old. Can you imagine? You're gonna, like, July 25th, you're gonna be making Christmas cookies, and then you're gonna put them down in your basement so they're soft in time for Christmas. I don't think we need to worry about that. I've gone ahead and we're gonna make a 1/3 recipe, because this will make a bazillion cookies. You don't want this many. Well, I would eat them all. But anyway, we're gonna make a 1/3 size recipe here. Let's start off with the chemical leavening part of this. You say, John, chemical leavening, I've never heard of it. I don't know what you're talking about. Well, anytime you're using baking soda or baking powder, that's chemical leavening. It's making a fizzy thing going on. And in our recipe, she uses pearl ash. That's an old primitive version. That's actually made from ashes from trees. You burn up a whole bunch of trees. We used to have, so many trees we didn't know what to do. So we'd burn them all down. We'd take the ashes and then we'd turn them into pearl ash, which turns out to be potassium carbonate. It's a very weak version of what turns out to be later on sodium bicarbonate. So she uses 3 teaspoons of pearl ash. We don't need nearly as much. This is a cut down recipe, but we need about half as much of baking soda, which is our closest equivalent to pearl ash. So I've got here a 1/2 teaspoon. It's not very much at all. 1/2 teaspoon, and we're going to dissolve that into 4 ounces of milk. Just regular whole milk will work fine. Next, we're gonna mix in these dry ingredients. I've got the butter and the sugar. They're kind of the easiest 2 things to get started with mixing. So I'm just gonna take a spoon here. I could soften this butter up a lot. I don't think I want it to be too softened. So you don't want it to be like super hard out of the refrigerator, or you're gonna break your arm getting these mixed in. But let's get the sugar and butter creamed together. Again, we're making 1/3 of a recipe, so I have a 1/2 pound of sugar and 1/3 pound of butter. Now I'm gonna mix our coriander into the flour, and we have 1 pound of flour and 1/4 cup of coriander ground. You want to make sure that it's nice and fresh coriander. This is the only spice in here. It doesn't even have nutmeg. So you wanna make sure that coriander's got a bite to it. If you need to, get some coriander seed and actually grind it up. If you want some really fresh, kind of, you want all of that coriander flavor, right? So we've got our coriander. I mixed it in with the flour. Now we're just gonna drop it in to our already creamed butter and sugar and get that all mixed up. We've got our dry ingredients and the butter all mixed nicely together. It's looking really good. I think that our baking soda is all dissolved, so it's ready to pour in. Our cookie dough is ready to roll out on the table. Let me clear off this table and we'll roll this out. Cut these into any decorative shape you like, just as Amelia Simmons directed. And these go into the oven. She calls for 15 to 20 minutes. With this kind of leavening, yeah, I would set your timer at 15 minutes and check them. You'll probably need to stay in there till 20 minutes. Bake it around 325 or so. It goes in a slow oven, as they say. So let's get these in the oven because I want to eat them. Okay, these are just out of the oven and they smell really, really good. I mean, I really want to try these. I'm gonna hold off for just a second though. I want to talk about the leavening. So I spent a lot of time talking about the leavening on these. I did do a few of these cookies earlier with the pearl ash leavening. Remember at the end, she talks about them being hard. Well, they are a good bit harder. They aren't nearly as fluffy. We might even, to get closer to the historical cookie, as it were, take that amount of leavening, the sodium bicarbonate, the baking soda, and half it again. Because here's one of the ones, there it is. It breaks open. It's not so hard you can't break it. But there's not very much fluffiness here. Here is the one that just came out of the oven, still warm. It breaks open, it's very soft, and there's a good bit more fluffiness, little air pockets in there. So I don't think these would get nearly as hard so that you have to put them in your basement for 6 months before you eat them. Definitely leavened more, they puff up a little bit more. You can tell these started out as squares and they pretty much end up as squares. These kind of grew a little bit in the oven. Isn't that interesting? Coriander is the only spice in here? I'm intrigued. No nutmeg, no cinnamon, no cloves, none of those things that we typically think of as Christmas. In fact, why does she think these are Christmas at all? Unless just the idea that a cookie goes with Christmas. I'll bet you that's the connection. The first one said cookie, and then another one said another Christmas cookie. Like, well, cookies, you make them at Christmas time. It's the only time you make them. Every day is Christmas for me. Coriander. Okay. Perfect cookie texture as far as I'm concerned. Wonderful flavor. I would never guess that a coriander cookie is going to taste like this, and it's really, really good. It's got the right amount of sweetness, not too sweet like some cookies can be today. I don't taste any of the leavening, which can be one of those things that can be, it's like, too much leavening and you get, doesn't taste good. These are perfect. I can exactly see why these would be Christmas cookies. And I want to eat every single one of them. It's great to be able to reach back into 18th century cookbooks and find something I can directly connect with Christmas. Thank you, Amelia Simmons. She did such a great job. And I can't wait to add these into my current Christmas tradition because I think they taste wonderful. We got a direct connect, and I'll be eating a lot of these in the future. Thanks for joining us today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. Merry Christmas. The recipe today is called a Christmas cookie. It's from Amelia Simmons's 1796 cookbook, American Cookery. It's very interesting here, a couple of different things. The first thing is that it's called a Christmas cookie. It's not something you normally see in an English cookbook. This is an American cookbook. She's definitely got some Dutch influence here. You can also tell not only by Christmas being included in it, which isn't a normal kind of big celebration in the 18th century for English, but also the word cookie, which is a reference to the Dutch word koeken, or their version of a cookie. And the third interesting thing about this recipe is that it uses pearl ash as the leavening agent. And we have pearl ash here. It's an item that we've started carrying at the store. We have this available in little 2-ounce packages, so you can experiment with pearl ash too. Pearl ash is a refinement or a component of the alkaline potash, which is extracted from burning trees or other vegetable matter. It's typically used in soap making and in dyeing and other industrial processes. But when this alkaline component is mixed with an acid in baking, you get a leavening effect. Now this recipe is a very simple one. We start off with 3½ cups of flour. To our flour, we will add 1 cup of sugar and 3 tablespoons of powdered coriander. For a lighter texture, I will rub in about 10 ounces of butter into our floured mixture. Our wet ingredients are very simple. I have 1¼ cup of sour milk. If you don't have sour milk, you can take regular milk and add, say, a tablespoon of lemon juice or vinegar to that. To our sour milk, let's add a ½ teaspoon of our pearl ash. It needs to completely dissolve before we add it into our dry ingredients. Once this is mixed well, it should be kneaded 5 to 10 minutes. If it's too moist, add a little extra flour. Once we're done kneading this, we can roll it out to a ½ inch or 3/4 of an inch thick. Once you've got it rolled out, you can cut this into any shape you'd like. I'm just going to cut simple rectangles. Today, let's bake these in our little reflector oven. This is very similar to reflector ovens you see in the 19th century, and we think they go back to the 18th century, but we're not really quite sure exactly how far back they go. But this is a perfect little tool for baking little items like this. In a home oven, you can bake these at about 325 for, say, 25 minutes. Notice the wonderful crumb. This pearl ash makes a wonderful, light and fluffy cookie. These look great. I'm sure they taste great. Let's try them out. Wow. That coriander flavor, completely different than what you're probably used to. Very light and fluffy. These aren't too chewy. They smell really nice. You should try these cookies out. It's almost Christmas, and what's more quintessentially Christmas than gingerbread? That's what we're going to be covering in this episode. Thanks for joining us today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. So gingerbread has this amazing rich history. It goes back centuries, certainly well into the Middle Ages. And in that time period, gingerbread wasn't just a simple treat that you would serve your family. It was a very, very expensive thing, sometimes thought of as something a bit more medicinal. The ingredients were very medicinal. In that time period, it was full of very, very expensive spices that came from overseas, as well as an expensive sweetening agent. Usually something like honey was used in those very early gingerbreads. In fact, they're really nothing like what we think of as gingerbread today. Here's a recipe from the 18th century that is a very 17th century style gingerbread, and it's almost gummy and gooey. You don't bake it at all. You just sort of cook it and let it harden. Made with breadcrumbs and very, very spicy. This one has lots of wine in it and it has brandy in it. It is an amazing recipe, but it's not something that really shows up too much by the time we get to the 18th century. Now, in the 18th century, gingerbread becomes more of a common thing. The molasses that gingerbread is made with is a very inexpensive sweetener. And ginger, by the time we get to the 18th century, becomes a very, very inexpensive spice. So it's gone from something that's really, really expensive to something that you could serve to anyone, any, economic level person. It would be sold on the street by street vendors, and people would go around selling it to children. So it's a really interesting evolution that gingerbread goes through. And in the 18th century, gingerbread's probably a little different than the kind of gingerbread we think of today. Most of the gingerbread recipes are a very hard cookie. By the time we get to the 19th century, well, those recipes change and gingerbread gets to be much softer, almost like a bread. So today we're going from Hannah Glass's cookbook. She is probably the most popular English cookbook author of our whole 18th century time period, and she's got several different gingerbread recipes. We're going to go with the one that is to make gingerbread cakes. So cake is just a little cookie-like item here. The recipe reads like this. Take 3 pounds of flour, 1 pound of sugar, 1 pound of butter rubbed in very fine, 2 ounces of ginger beat fine, a large nutmeg grated, then take a pound of treacle, 1/4 of a pint of cream, and make them warm together. And make up the bread stiff. Roll it out, make it up into thin cakes, cut them out with a teacup or a small glass, or roll them round like nuts, and bake them on tin plates in a slack oven. So we don't have a lot of ingredients here. Our spices are just ginger and nutmeg, what you would normally expect. Now, some of the real fancy recipes are going to include cinnamon and cloves and mace and whatever. This seems like the whole, spice cabinet gets tossed into some of these fancy ones, but this is a lot more typical. We start off with 3 pounds of flour, and let's get the sugar and the butter together. We're going to do a 1/3 recipe on this. So we're going to cut all our measurements down by 1/3. We take 1 pound of flour, and I would just use an all-purpose flour here. If we were trying to replicate a street gingerbread, well, maybe we would use a whole wheat flour. But in this case, all-purpose flour, 1 pound. To that, we're going to add 1/3 of a pound of sugar. That's about 5.5 ounces or so. And we just use regular granulated sugar, dump that up on top, and mix it. After that, in goes our butter. And again, we're using a 1/3 of a pound of butter. And we're going to rub this in, just like we were doing a pie crust. Once we've got this mostly mixed in, it's time for our spices. We've got our main spice, which is ginger. And the recipe calls for 2 ounces, so we're gonna use about 1/3 of that, so a little less than 1 ounce. That's a lot of ginger, let me tell you. But I like ginger. Sometimes it can, if you add too much, it can get a little bitter, so you might wanna try just a 1/2 ounce. And you can taste the batter when we're done, and maybe add a little bit more if you need a little bit more ginger. So we've got a little bit more than 1 ounce, or about 1 ounce of ginger here. And then, of course, we want nutmeg. And we're gonna use about 1/3 of a nutmeg. It's not a lot of nutmeg, but that'll add just that little bit. Give it the perfect 18th century flavor because nutmeg's in everything. Let's move on to the wet ingredients. We've got molasses and cream. We're gonna take those, put them together, and warm them up. That'll make it mix so much easier. Now, the recipe calls for treacle. And treacle in the 18th century, as far as I can tell, is basically our standard molasses. So we're just using a typical molasses that you would get at the store. There's our molasses, and then our cream. Again, this is the 1/3 equivalent is 2 tablespoons of cream. Let's just put this over the fire for a little bit. Really, we're just warming these up to get them thin. This is your chance to be as creative as you want while you're cutting these out. They made them in little squares, different sorts of geometric shapes. We're gonna make a few gingerbread men, and yes, they did do gingerbread men. So these are ready to go into the oven, 300 and let's say 25 degrees. And we want these to bake kind of hard. We don't expect them to fluff up. So they're probably gonna be a 1/2 hour in the oven. Our gingerbread is out of the oven and it smells so good. Now, we could let it cool and put decorations on them, and they did that. They gilt the gingerbread. They might put little designs on it. They might put letters on it so children can learn their ABCs. All sorts of things were done with gingerbread. But many times it was sold on the street warmed up in the wintertime. So they would have these stands and they would cook it and you would eat it when it's still warm. This is still warm. Let's give it a try. And let me tell you, it does smell really good. Since it's warm, it's still soft. Perfect texture. Even though there's no leavening in this, it still has a very, very nice texture. It's not too dense, which is something that you kind of worry about. If it cools, it'll get pretty hard, and, you know, it'll get snappy like a cracker. But when it's warmed up, so good. And it's very gingery, let me tell you. This ginger just, it really takes over the whole thing. There's a reason why you don't need to put in a lot of the other spices, because the ginger will come right up to the top. So super gingery. You know, some people might think it's a little too gingery. I think that's the point of gingerbread. Let's make it gingery. This one's really good. It's got about the right amount for me. And the right kind of sweetness, not too much. It's got sugar and molasses in it. That balances it out. If it's just molasses, you get too much molasses flavor. This one's balanced really well. I've tried a couple different recipes from the 18th century. This one is one of the best. And I'm really excited about how this particular one turned out. I've got here the 17th century gingerbread to try out too. It's not really like bread, like we would call it bread at all. It's a lot more like a candy. This is made with boiling, a red port wine, and then you add in all this sugar and make a syrup, and then you add in breadcrumbs, and then a little bit of brandy, and then boil that a little bit, and then add more breadcrumbs until it turns into this consistency. This is fairly fresh, so it's still pliable. In the 17th century, they would let this dry and get harder, but it's got a bit more of a candy flavor to it. Even though it's got about the same amount of ginger for the quantity, in this other form, it's really good. I mean, I've made it sometimes before with different recipes and it didn't turn out. This one, though, it's not anything like what we would consider gingerbread. It's very good. I mean, I love digging into these recipes that are different than what we're sort of used to today. And digging into the history of foods where we can really see the roots as they go back and how the recipes changes, how the food changes. I'm really excited about this particular one because it's so a little different than our standard gingerbread, but so good. Welcome to 18th Century Cooking. I'm your host, John Townsend, and today we're going to be baking something that you could use for holiday treats so special. These are little tartlets right from the 18th century cookbooks. Thanks for joining us today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. So today's recipe comes from the lady's assistant, Charlotte Mason. And we've been using this cookbook a lot. It's a really a good cookbook. This one's from 1777, this particular edition. Tartlets. Have a very small and shallow tin pans, butter them, lay in a bit of puff paste, we'll talk about that later, marking it neatly around the edges, leave a hole in the middle, bake them. When they are cool, fill them with custard or put into each half an apricot, raspberry jam or other preserved fruit, a little preserved apple or marmalade, pour over it custard with a very little sugar in it. And also at the bottom here, icing for tarts. Beat the white of an egg, rub it on the tarts with a feather, sift over it double refined sugar. So we're gonna be making these very small little tartlets. Again, they're almost like hors d'oeuvres, right? They're just little single serving pieces, and that means we can have all kinds of fun. We can make all sorts of different types. Before we get started on our tart tins, before we start putting the paste in, let's talk about this paste for just a second. She calls for puff paste. And now today you and I can go to the grocery store and we can buy a box of puff paste. And in fact, I recommend it. It is great stuff. The problem is it's not the same puff paste that she's talking about in here. She actually has a direction for puff paste. Rub as much butter into some flour as possible without it feeling all greasy. It must be rubbed in quite fine. Put water in it to make it a nice light paste. Roll it out, stick bits of butter all over it, flour it, roll it up again, do this 3 times. Today's puff paste probably has been, rolled over with layers, a dozen times or 20 times for all I know. It's made in a very industrial process, and they can do it over and over and over again. Somebody in the 18th century who's making their own puff paste is not going to do that. So it doesn't have as many layers of butter, and it doesn't puff up as much as today's puff paste. If we use today's puff paste in this little tin, it would crawl right out of the tin and it wouldn't be useful to us at all. So we're going to be using the short crust, and in the short crust recipe, she says this is the one that you will use for all tarts. So even though the tartlet recipe says use puff paste, in the short crust recipe, she says this is the one you want to use for all the tarts. So short crust is what we are going to use. So let's cut out some little circles a little bit bigger than our tart tin. Probably, I don't know, almost a 1/2 inch bigger than what that tart tin looks like. Because it's got to fold up and go down into the bottom. So we'll just start with this one to see how it works out before we get going too much farther. We're going to butter our tin first. And I'm going to be generous with that because we want these to pop right out so that we can serve them up. We're just going to sort of fold this up a little bit. I'll even get it into a kind of a cup shaped before I get started. Send that down in there. And I'm not going to worry that I have a little bit too much around the outside because this stuff shrinks down a lot, more than you might want. So I'm actually going to just flange the top of it almost out and leave that. There we go. So there, that one looks pretty good. We can bake this up before we put the contents in it. So we'll start with one like that. That was a good size. To hold this down, because we're baking these empty, we're gonna actually add some beans inside of here. Nice dry beans that we can pour out later. They'll help hold the shape. And then we're gonna try a little bit of this frosting before they go in the oven. A little bit of egg white that's been whipped up just enough to make it so it isn't stringy. And then we're gonna add a little bit of sugar to the top of that. So now they go right into the oven at 450 degrees for say 12 or 15 minutes. You'll need to watch them and see what they're doing in your oven. Now our recipe gives us all sorts of different ways we can put the fillings in, and she's really calling for sweetmeats of the time period. Some recipes would just say put sweetmeats in here. So we've got things like jams, marmalades, different kinds of dried fruit. So apricots she calls for, dates. You could use other ones at the same time. Any sweet item that you could put in here, and then to kind of balance that, you don't want just sweet. We've got the balance of the nice cool custard that's in there at the same time. And really, if you really want the last little beautiful sprinkle, you could put cinnamon on top, or even better, a little nutmeg sprinkled up on top, and they are beautiful. Let's go ahead and try one of these out. I've got one of these that has the glazing, it's got the custard on top, and then it's got a wonderful strawberry preserve underneath. Again, this is a perfect opportunity to use some preserves. Let's find out. I know you're saying, oh, this is gonna taste horrible, John, right? The crust was perfect. Not baked too much. Again, wonderful sweetness of the preserves underneath. The amazing lightness of the custard up on top. They really go together well. Again, with a little bit of nutmeg. So, so good. Now, if you're interested in the pie crust, it's like, John, how did you make the crust? Go back to the apple pie episode we did just a few weeks ago. And I did just a very, very simple short crust for that. And for the custard, way back a year or two ago, we did a wonderful apple pie with a custard filling, almost exactly the same thing. So there we talk about the custard, so check that out. Whew, this one is really good and so beautiful and perfect for the holidays. You have guests over, you want to beautify your table, and you've got all these things. You can do these. They're so decorative as well as being so very wonderful. Today we're going to be doing a recipe that I have been chasing down for weeks, and it turns out it is broken. We are going to fix it. Thanks for joining us today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. So today's recipe is called to make lemon cheesecakes. That sounds really good this time of year, doesn't it? So that's why I wanted to make it. Well, it turns out if you just open up your random 18th century cookbook, you're gonna find probably a lemon cheesecake recipe. More likely you'll find 2 or 3 or maybe 4 lemon cheesecakes recipes in, your typical cookbook. I found one that I thought looked wonderful and simple, and I really wanted to try it out. I started to chase that recipe down because you'll find out that in 18th century cookbooks, they just copy from each other. So this particular little recipe, it gets copied in cookbooks for a span of like 100 years. You will find this recipe. So I started to chase it back and back to find the original one. I mean, when I mean copy, I mean word for word, misspellings, punctuation, everything. They just copy it all. They don't have any reservation about that whatsoever. One of the earliest ones for this particular recipe shows up in The Complete Housewife, Eliza Smith. It's a wonderful, simple cheesecake recipe, and if you're thinking this cheesecake is going to be like the cheesecake you're used to, well, that's a problem too. The cheesecakes that we experience today are an invention of the 20th century. Cheesecakes in the 18th century, totally different. Well, maybe not totally different, but definitely different. They probably even have cheese in them. Anyway, this one is so wonderful and simple. It says to make lemon cheesecakes, take a peel of 2 large lemons, boil it very tender, then pound it well in a mortar with 1/4 pound or more of loaf sugar, the yolks of 6 eggs, 1/2 pound of fresh butter, mix a pound and mix all well together, fill your patty pans half full, and then it just stops basically there. It goes on and says orange cheesecakes can be done in the same way, only you must boil the peels in 2 or 3 waters to take out the bitterness. So this sounds really simple. Obviously, it doesn't have cheese in it, like any kind of cheese. We have other recipes in the same cookbook. If we go back or forward a couple of pages, we get to make cheesecakes without curd. So here they're using actual cheese in their cheesecakes. And then if we move on a couple pages, we get to make lemon cheesecakes. And it's kind of similar, but something else happens in here. They end up cooking this mixture, whereas the recipe that we're looking at has no cooking going whatsoever. You're just pounding these ingredients together, mixing them up, and then expecting that to work. So I thought, why not? I'll try this one out. So a couple days ago, I started working on making these cheesecakes, and well, it kind of works. I mean, but the problem is it just plain, by our modern standards of making food, the presentation is terrible on this. What happens is the butter melts and it doesn't coalesce, it doesn't get into this mixture, and it stays as a liquid on top. And if the cheesecake is warm, the butter just runs out, and if it gets cold, then you have this layer of just butter in there. It's kind of distasteful to at least look at and understand what's going on. The eggs sort of clump up together. It just doesn't look good, but I mean, it tastes all right. But it isn't right. Obviously, it isn't right. The question is did they not know? Did they never try this recipe out? Why did they bother to put this recipe in cookbook after cookbook when it just doesn't work out right? It could be they understood there was more to this recipe than what it looks like. So there were steps in it that they expected you to know to do that they didn't bother to write down. I think some of these other recipes help us understand that a little bit more. Let's take the hints out of this 3rd recipe in the cookbook, and I'll just cut to the chase here. 12 yolks of eggs, 8 whites of eggs, well beaten, then melt 1/2 pound of butter in 4 or 5 spoonfuls of cream. Stir it all together, set it over the fire, stirring it till it becomes pretty thick. So what they're doing is they're creating a kind of, custard here, right? And then they're incorporating these other ingredients and then they're gonna bake it. That makes a whole lot more sense. I think that's what they actually intend in this earlier recipe. We're gonna take out the cream, because it doesn't have any cream in that earlier recipe. We're gonna take that butter and those eggs, and we're gonna cook them slowly. We don't wanna fry our eggs. We're gonna cook them very slowly until they thicken up into something like a custard, then mix in the lemon and the sugar. So let's get started with this particular recipe. And the way we get the flavor of the lemons here, I really like. It's very different from what we would do today. Today, we'd probably put some lemon juice in there and then zest the lemon in. They don't do that. They say take the peel of 2 large lemons, boil it very tender. So we're gonna be using the whole peel here to get that lemon flavor. While our lemon peels are boiling, we're gonna work on this butter and egg mixture. Again, the recipe is, they just mix them together. That just will not work. So what we're gonna do is take our egg yolks and whisk them up till they're nice and blended. We're gonna take our butter and place it over the fire in our little saucepan here. Heat it up very gently. We don't want it to get hot, but we want that butter to be melted. We're gonna put our eggs into that and then slowly bring up the heat and mix it and mix it and mix it. Stir it until it thickens up. It might take quite a while as we bring that heat up. We don't want to cook those eggs. That's the deal. We don't want scrambled eggs in butter. We want this wonderful thick mixture like custard. So our butter and eggs are done off the fire, and now I'm working on these lemon peels. I let the water cool off so I could get these out of the water and chop them up into some little bits, and now I want to mash them down into a paste. The nice part about this is, I mean, it's completely different than what we're used to. We won't get this into a full paste, and we will leave some little bit of chunkiness there. It's going to bring in a different consistency than kind of we expect. If we think about, say, candied lemon peel or orange peel, like we've done in a previous episode, we get that really interesting kind of like I don't know, like a gelled candy consistency out of these. And that's what I kind of like about this, is it's very different than the way we would normally bring that lemon flavor in. Poured in our cooled off mixture of the butter and the egg yolks. And you saw some lumps going in. That was cooled off. You might have thought maybe those were like cooked eggs in there. No, that wasn't that. It was the milk solids that had kind of separated out and had, just clumped up because they were cold. Those mix right in. So I don't have any problem with that also. I think this is going to turn out so much better. I think. Sometimes, though, you just don't know. I mean, you can fight these recipes all you want, and they just aren't going to turn out the way we expect them to. But I think this is definitely going to be better. Our cheesecake mixture goes into little pies. So they've got a little pie crust here, just standard flour, butter, a little bit of salt, a little bit of water. And then our mixture gets dabbed into the middle of this. They get baked. There's no directions in the recipe, but I would say 20 minutes at 350 degrees. Our little cheesecakes are ready. I've let them cool so I don't burn myself tasting these. This is my original one that I didn't like. The recipe that really didn't work. The butter just separates, doesn't look right, and they're really kind of sloppy when that butter is warm. These new ones, really much better. The consistency looks good. The question is, what did they end up tasting like? And so let's find out. Oh, great consistency. And really what I think when they are talking about cheesecake here in the 18th century, they're mostly actually talking about consistency. Not so much does it have cheese in it, but does it have a cheese-like consistency to it? It seems like, because there's all different kinds of recipes for cheesecake, and really the consistency seems to be the one thing that connects them all up together. It's got wonderful, lemony flavor to it. The consistency is nice and consistent throughout, and it doesn't have those strange layers of, melted or solidified butter that's all separated out. So very, very good flavor. I'm really happy with the way this fix turned out, so to speak. This brings me to this. I found this just the other day. Thought this was very, very interesting. So this recipe is 1730, and we had to tweak it a little bit. This is 1714, I think. A very, very early 18th century cookbook. The recipe is titled "The Best Orange Pudding That Ever Was Tasted." I love that title. This is the best one ever. Don't even bother to make any other ones. That's the way it should be. It's almost exactly the same recipe, bar a few differences. Number one, they're using orange and they're just zesting it, which is what we would do. And they use almost the same amount of butter and sugar, but instead of 6 yolks, 16 yolks. That's what I think is part of the fix here. And they work that together. There's not so much butter there. So either we really have to attack that butter and mix it with those yolks and cook it so that they don't separate, or we add so many yolks in there that the emulsification of those yolks really works on that butter and hooks them together so that they don't separate. Again, this texture is so good. I really like the way this one worked out, and it's the right kind of denseness. You might be thinking about a cheesecake today, and they can either be kind of light and fluffy, or even a dense cheesecake can kind of have like too much to it. I'm not sure how to explain that. Some people really don't care for cheesecakes because of the texture on this. I really like the texture on this compared to even a modern cheesecake. So I would suggest this as something to try. I don't know, maybe in a modern world whether we would call this a cheesecake, but they certainly do in the 18th century. Burnt wine doesn't sound all that appetizing, but that's what we're going to be cooking today. Thanks for coming along and savoring the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. So this particular recipe is from a French cookbook from the 17th century, about 1650 or so. Let me read it real quick. It's burnt wine. Get a silver pitcher or a new earthenware crock. Put into it a pint of good wine, a pound of sugar, a little mace, some long pepper, cloves, a sprig of laurel, 2 sprigs of rosemary. Have a big charcoal fire. Put your crock in the middle of it with flames all around it. And when it is boiling strongly, set it on fire with a paper spill. When the fire dies down, take the crock off the fire and drink it while it's hot. Sounds exciting. Burnt wine in the 18th century a lot of times actually just meant brandy. The definition kind of changes in here, but this idea of a spiced wine continues on into the 18th century, probably with a slightly different name. Let's get started on this burnt wine. I'm using a Merlot wine that I happen to have around. This is a chance for you to experiment with flavors. They don't call for this specific type of wine here, so this is your chance of saying, let me try it with this kind of wine or that kind of wine. You can get the idea about how you want to attack this. For spices, we've got our mace, which is a cousin to nutmeg. We've got long pepper. Now you might not have recognized long pepper, but long pepper is one of those peppers that's more of a common in medieval cookery in Europe. It kind of loses favor and you don't see it referenced too much in the 18th century, but it's got somewhat of a more spicy flavor than a black pepper. So we're gonna put these long peppers in there. We've got cloves. I'm just gonna put a couple of whole cloves in. It says laurel, and it probably means bay laurel or a bay leaf. Put that in, and then we have a sprig of rosemary. Just gonna twist that here. And we also need to put in, of course, at the very beginning, we've got sugar. It calls for a pound of sugar. That seems like an awful lot to me, so I'm going to put in less than a pound of sugar, maybe 8 ounces or so. You know, that's something we'll have to experiment with and see what it's like when we get done. There we go. This is all put together. Let's get it over our large charcoal fire. I'm going to make sure to stir this to get all the sugar dissolved in there. And you might be wondering why they chose this particular pot. They were very specific in the kind of vessel that they wanted to cook this in. Either a silver pitcher or a new ceramic pot, a pottery piece. And really they're worried about the flavors coming in from our cooking vessel. So if we used a brass kettle or some other tinned vessel like we use so often, you'll get that brassy flavor in there, and we don't want that. So they were specific about the kind of vessels. And so some really expensive cookery would be those silver cooking items, which they had little silver saucepans, or in this case, a much more common ceramic vessel. These didn't last a long time in the time period, so that's why they called for a new one. They wanted it to be clean, unbroken, completely, so that's why we're using this. Once this has started boiling, we can take this off the fire, take our paper match, and we can ignite it. And it should continue to flame up while it's still sort of boiling. This will only ignite while it's still boiling. Once that fire's died down, we're gonna let this cool off enough so that we can drink it, but drink it while it's hot. There is our burnt wine. It's just down to a drinkable temperature. It said drink it while it's hot. So let's give this a try. Of course, it's just filled the kitchen with these wonderful smells of this wine cooking along with these spices. So I can't wait to see what it tastes like. Wow. Very, very rich and full of flavor. We've got, of course, the wine right up on top, and it's very sweet with the sugar. You could cut that back, you know, even cut it back further than I cut it back. And then we have these spices that come in. You've got, you know, kind of a typical clove taste that you're going to find in some other things like that. But then we add in these very interesting rosemary and a little bit of bay leaf in there. We get this really interesting peppery flavor from that long pepper. It's a little spicier, but it's not overwhelming at all. We didn't put a lot in there. And then, boy, that little bit of nutmeg flavor that you get in there with the mace. So rich, so flavorful, and warm, like a warm dessert drink for the winter. Just right here in the cold weather, this is something that you really want to have to warm you up. Such a wonderful, great flavor. Ivy, this is looking great, just in time for Christmas.
Thanks, Dad. What are we making today?
We are going to be making a recipe that's called the Little Deer Antlers. Thanks for joining us today.
So where does this recipe come from, Dad?
Well, this recipe is from The Raised Hearth. It's a book that the folks down at Old Salem, down in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, they're working on this cookbook that's got 2 translated German cookbooks kind of all into one. I think the title of the book is going to be The Raised Hearth. Some of the folks down there are Kayla and Karen. They've been working on this, and they sent us sort of a pre-publication version of this. And I was digging through this recipe book and found this recipe that looks like it'll be perfect for Christmas. It's called Little Deer Antlers, and it's in the section of the cookbook called Things Fried in Lard, so you know it's got to be good.
So what do we need for this recipe, Dad?
Well, this recipe, it's actually got measurements, unlike a lot of the recipes that we look at. But the measurements are in German. They didn't necessarily translate those for us. Let's see, it says 6 loaf of flour. What do you think a loaf is?
I have no idea.
So they had like a glossary. They said a loaf is something like a tablespoon plus a teaspoon. I don't know exactly what it was. I did some measurements and I came up with 2/3 of a cup of flour. So let's hope that's close to being right. It has sugar in it and it says half a Veerling. Yeah, half a Veerling. Let's see, what did I come up with? 4 ounces of sugar. So I got 4 ounces of raw sugar there, and it also had half a Veerling of butter. So I got some cold butter here. It's got some other ingredients too. I think it says something like some lemon. What do you think it means? Some lemon. I love these recipes. It's like, put some lemon in it. Well, some lemon juice, some lemon, I don't know. So I have here lemon zest. We're gonna hope that works in this recipe. I've got zest from a half a lemon or zest from a lemon. It's got some cinnamon in it, which will make something nice and Christmassy, and it's got an egg in it. And then of course it says something like mix in with a little bit of milk at the end. So we need flour, sugar, butter, and then we'll add some of these other ingredients later on.
Sounds good. How do we start mixing this up?
I'll have you do most of the mixing here. Why don't you go ahead and let's mix all the dry ingredients up. So put your flour and your sugar, put the zest in there too. Yep. Maybe we won't use all the zest right away. I don't know how lemony we want this. There's all your sugar. Let's do a teaspoon of cinnamon there. Stir that up with your hands, get it all mixed in there. Now that all the dry ingredients are in there and kind of mixed up, bring in the butter. And you remember how we've done butter in the past where you kind of rub it in, you don't want to get it to melt on your fingertips. So you're going to put the butter in, you're going to mix it up, you're going to kind of rub it in. Ivy's doing a great job here getting this all mixed up. It calls for an egg and a yolk. You know, they were probably working with little tiny eggs at the time, and I don't think we need as much. So I'm just gonna do 1 egg. This egg is all mixed up. We can put that in there and fold that in, and let's start to see what it turns into. See what kind of, how much more moisture we need to have this. We don't want it to be a batter. We want it to be a dough. We want it to be stiff enough so that when we shape it into little antlers, that it holds its shape when we put it into the hot lard. So I'm gonna add just a touch of milk, although we don't hardly need any here. And go ahead and keep mixing that up. And now it's just a matter of adding a little bit of flour until we get to some kind of consistency. Okay, so let's get it out of this bowl. Go ahead and let's turn it out onto, or get it all out of there. There you go. And let's get a little bit of flour down here. Okay, so you keep working on this, getting it into a bit of a stiff dough here. And I'm gonna get the fire going on underneath our hot lard so that we can start to cook these. As soon as the fire is going, we'll start to shape these into our little antlers. Okay, so I've got the fat on the fire, and let me see this. Yeah, I think we got the right kind of sort of cookie dough consistency. That looks good. And let's go ahead and try to make some antler shapes. So I think what we need to do is take a little section here that's about, I don't know, half an egg, right? Let's roll it out into a little hot dog shape there, and we'll flatten it out. Notice how it's kind of arched. I'm gonna take 2 little cuts. You can do that with any kind of simple knife. Point the end a little bit and point the little cut off piece, and like that, look at that. So now we know what kind of shape to make them in. You keep making those shapes, and I'm gonna check on our temperature over here. Well, They turned out great. We had a lot of fun cooking these things up, and let's find out what they taste like. You go ahead, Ivy. Those are good. Those are really, really good.
These are really, really good.
Imagine sugar cookie, but fried like a donut, okay? This is good. And these don't even have any icing or, I mean, you could put icing on these. You could probably put powdered sugar on them if you wanted to go crazy. In the directions, it says to cut these in any shape you like, obviously. I mean, they're called little antlers, but obviously some of these are, Ivy did some star shapes.
I'm getting a little bit of the lemon and the cinnamon. I can taste the cinnamon, and it's definitely sweet.
Yeah, you could go probably a little heavier on the cinnamon or on the lemon. They're both kind of buried under there. So if you want to, get a little bit more of a little flavor, you can add that. You could probably go crazy and add some nutmeg to this to get a little different holiday flavor. Really good. Today we're making a wonderful honey cake. Thanks for joining us today on 18th Century Cooking with James Townsend and Son. This honey cake recipe is from Amelia Simmons's 1796 cookbook, American Cookery. It is probably what we would think of as a gingerbread today. It is sweetened with honey, like many of the early gingerbread recipes were, but this one is leavened. It's leavened with pearl ash, which is not typical of early gingerbread recipes. Because this is leavened, it's got a nice and fluffy texture, unlike most of those early gingerbreads that were a very hard cake. Like our last recipe, this one's very simple. We're gonna start off with 3½ cups of flour. To our flour, I'll add 1 tablespoon of ginger, 1 tablespoon of cinnamon, and 3 tablespoons of diced candied orange peel. Let's also add 1/3 of a cup of white sugar. Now let's focus on our wet ingredients. I have 1 egg well beaten, and to this I will add 2/3 of a cup of honey. I have 1¼ cups of milk. Now this works best if you have sour milk. If you don't have sour milk, you can add, say, a tablespoon of lemon juice or vinegar to this. And to this milk, I will add 1/2 teaspoon of our pearl ash. It needs to completely dissolve before we add it into our dry ingredients. Finally, we'll add our milk and pearl ash mixture to the honey and egg. After kneading, let's roll these out to 1/2 inch or 3/4 inch thick. Again, you can cut these in any shape you like. We're going to cut them in a simple rectangle. For baking these, I'm going to use the tin kitchen that's in our catalog. If you're going to bake them at home, I would suggest 325 at approximately 25 minutes. These look great. Let's see how they taste. So They're very nice. They have a wonderful spicy sweet flavor with the honey. They're a little chewy, but light and fluffy. It's certainly not hard at all. You can see the wonderful crumb on these. They're nice and light and fluffy. This pearl ash is doing a great job of leavening these. They're probably extremely popular in their day. These are really, really wonderful. These make a great holiday treat. In this episode, I'm taking a step into the future. Well, not really so much the future. Normally, we focus on the 18th century. In this episode, we're going to be doing an early 19th century recipe. The recipe I'm making today is from John Cook's 1824 cookbook, Cooking and Confectionery. It's what's called a light gingerbread. I'll explain in a minute exactly why this is so special. Thanks for joining us today on 18th Century Cooking with James Townsend and Son. So while this recipe that we're doing today is actually a fairly simple, common sort of gingerbread, one of the interesting things is it uses alum as one of the leavening agents. So in our Exploring the 18th Century chemical leavening series, we talked about bread adulterants in the mid-18th century and how there was great alarm at the bakers using alum in their bread. And yet here we have an early 19th century recipe that's using alum as a leavening agent. The original recipe is rather large, so I've downsized this considerably. We're going to start with 2 cups of flour. To this, I'll stir in 2 teaspoons of powdered ginger. Next, I'll add 1 cup of light or Barbados molasses. Warming this first will make it easier to mix into the flour. Now for our wet ingredients, I'll take a few tablespoons of milk, divided evenly. In half of this milk, I'll dissolve 3/4 of a teaspoon of pearl ash. In the other half, I'll dissolve 1 teaspoon of alum. Pearl ash can be very difficult to find, so James Townsend and Son now carries food-grade pearl ash in 2-ounce bottles. You can substitute it with baking soda, but baking soda was a mid-19th century invention. Alum can be found in the spice section in your local grocer. If you would prefer not to use alum, you can use a couple tablespoons of vinegar instead. And I'll stir this in very well. The result is a very sticky batter. I'm going to bake this in a tart tin that has been well buttered. If you're baking this at home, you'll want to preheat your oven and bake this at 400 degrees for about 15 minutes. We gotta give this a try. Very wonderful, very fluffy. It's got a great gingerbread taste with the mix between the ginger and the molasses. This is an excellent, very interesting, almost like a ginger cake. Very moist though. This is really something special. If you haven't watched our Exploring the 18th Century series on chemical leavening, I really invite you to do so. It really helps tease out and get to the roots of chemical leavening all throughout the 18th and 19th century.
Today we're making what Amelia Simmons calls a light and fluffy cake. Thanks for joining us today on 18th Century Cooking. Today's recipe comes from Amelia Simmons' American Cookery Cookbook. It's from 1796. This wonderful cookbook has many recipes for cakes and cookies. Before we get started, let's go over the ingredients. We have 1 pound of all-purpose flour. You'll also need a 1/2 pound of butter and a 1/2 pound of sugar, 3 ounces of wine, in this case I'm using apple juice, We'll also be using 1 ounce of orange blossom water. I also have a packet of yeast I've prepared in 6 ounces of warm water. We'll also need a few spices. I've got a teaspoon of nutmeg and a teaspoon of cinnamon. The last ingredient is 8 ounces of Zante currants. To start this off, we're going to cream our butter into our sugar. Now we're going to rub our flour into our sugar and butter. We don't want to melt our butter, so I'm just pinching this and letting go so it doesn't get too warm. Now I'm going to put in my spices and my Zante currants. And now finally we can add our liquid ingredients. We have orange flower water, apple juice, and prepared yeast. And now we can stir it up. Now, we're trying to get a very thick batter or a very soft dough. Now I'm going to set it in a warm place for 2 hours to let it rise. Now that this dough has doubled in size, we can put the little dough balls into the patty pans. Make sure that they're pre-buttered. Now that the dough balls are in the patty pans, we're going to let them rise a second time so that they double in size again. Once these have risen, we can put them in the oven at 350 degrees for 20 minutes. I've invited Dad in so we can try these out.
They look really good and they turned out light and fluffy. This was like the 3rd or 4th time that we tried these, and it took a little bit to get that yeast going. It's cold outside and the house is cold, so it took a lot of kind of warmth, and then, wow, once you got the right kind of warmth, they really took off and they got light and fluffy. Let's try them out. Well, they're nice and light and fluffy. They have a wonderful flavor. What do you taste when you bite into them, Ivy?
I taste those currants. They really bring out the sweetness.
Yeah, there's not a lot of sugar in these, so the sweetness is really mostly held up by the currants. If those weren't in there, it would be kind of bland. So if you experiment with these a little bit, if you want more of a spicy bread, like making your own raisin bread, these things turn out to be very much like raisin bread. If you double or triple the amount of cinnamon that Ivy put in the recipe, maybe double the amount of nutmeg, and you're gonna have a really wonderful cinnamon bread. Well, there you have it. It was right out of Amelia Simmons's Little American Cookery Cookbook. That book is available on our website and in our print catalog. I'll make sure to put a link to that wonderful little cookbook right there from 1796. I want to thank Ivy for picking this one out and doing it. It's wonderful. The flavors were wonderful, and it was pretty easy to do. Something that you can do with your kids. If you have kids and you want to experiment in the kitchen, great little recipe for that. So make sure to try it out if you've got kids. And I want to thank Ivy, and I want to thank you for coming along as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century.
Today's recipe is a perfect complement to a recent apple pie recipe we did. Thanks for joining us today. Many late 18th century English cookbooks contained apple pie recipes, and most of these apple pie recipes had custards that went along with them that complemented them. The custard recipe we're making today comes from the Experienced English Housekeeper, 1769. Let's go over the ingredients. This recipe is really simple. We're going to start with a pint of cream, and it says sugar to taste, and I'm not quite sure what that means, so I'm going to put 2 spoonfuls of sugar in here. Oh, and it also says to put a cinnamon stick with that. This is ready to put over the fire. So this recipe calls to boil the cream, but since the cream is already pasteurized, we don't really need to boil this. All we're trying to do is infuse the cinnamon flavor, and we're also trying to melt the sugar into this cream. We've taken the cream off the fire so it can cool, and now we can prepare 4 egg yolks. We have our egg yolks, and now we're going to mix them up. Now that our egg yolks are all whisked up, we can put them in this if it's the right temperature. So it feels cool enough, so we can put these in. Oh, we need to take out our cinnamon stick. Now we can put our egg yolks in. This is ready to put back on the fire. The most important part of this recipe is that we stir this custard constantly so that it doesn't burn or curdle. We'll know when it's done by how thick it gets. This was super easy to make, but it takes a lot of patience to do. It took about 15 minutes for this to get to the right consistency. So let's try this. That is really good. You can really taste the cinnamon in that custard. It reminds me of whipped cream or an ice cream that you would put on top of apple pie. You should really try this recipe.